A bruised 15-year-old boy stands in the rain outside a motorcycle garage in a dead factory town, blood running from his swollen eye, zip tie marks carved deep into both wrists. He has one question for the scarred ex-biker blocking the door. "Can I sleep in your garage tonight?" What this man doesn't know yet is that this boy carries evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in the county. What the boy doesn't know is that this mechanic buried his own brother because of the same secret. And by morning, 3 black SUVs will surround this building with men who kill witnesses for a living. If you think you know where this story goes, you don't. Stay until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The rain came sideways through Coldwater, Ohio, like it had a personal grudge against anyone still breathing inside the town limits. Not the soft rain that farmers prayed for. Not the kind that made children press their faces against windows. This was the industrial kind. Cold, metallic, tasting faintly of rust and old steel. The kind that hammered corrugated rooftops until the whole town sounded like a war zone nobody acknowledged. Water pooled in cracked asphalt. It gathered in the ruts where 18-wheelers had carved permanent scars into Route 41. It filled potholes outside the Coldwater grain and feed like shallow graves waiting to be discovered. And through it all, the neon sign above Deacon's Liquor Mart flickered in its dying rhythm. Red, then nothing, then red again. Painting the wet sidewalk in pulses of cheap light that made everything look like a crime scene photograph. Ryder Vale stood inside the open bay of Vale Brothers Custom, watching the storm eat the parking lot one puddle at a time. He didn't move, didn't flinch at the thunder cracking overhead, just stood there with his hands black to the wrists from 12 hours of engine work, a cigarette burning down to the filter between his lips, his eyes locked on nothing and everything at once. 47 years old, built like a man who'd been assembled from motorcycle parts and bad decisions. A scar running from his left ear to his jawline, the kind you don't get from falling off a bicycle. Knuckles that had been broken so many times they'd stopped healing flat. A face that looked like it had been designed to make people cross the street. He wore a faded black thermal under a grease-stained canvas work shirt. No logos. No patches anymore. The leather cut that once made grown men step aside hung on a nail in the back office, covered in dust and ghosts. Ryder exhaled smoke into the rain and checked his watch. 9:47, Tuesday. Another dead day in a dead town that refused to officially die. He'd rebuilt a Harley Sportster fuel system, replaced the clutch cable on a beat-to-hell Triumph Bonneville that belonged to a farmer who'd probably never pay, and spent 2 hours trying to source a carburetor for a 1978 shovelhead that didn't exist anymore. The garage was all he had left. 3 bays, a parts room that smelled like diesel and copper, a cot in the back office where he slept most nights because the apartment upstairs felt too much like living. The sign out front still said Vale Brothers, plural. There was only one Vale left. Ryder crushed the cigarette under his boot and reached for the chain to close the bay door. The hydraulic mechanism had been broken for 2 years. He used a chain and padlock now because fixing things for other people was easier than fixing anything for himself. He pulled the door down with a grinding screech of metal, locked it, walked around to the side gate and began threading the heavy chain through the bars, his fingers numb from the cold, rain streaming down the back of his neck. Then he heard it, a voice so thin it barely registered above the storm. "Please." Ryder's hand stopped on the chain. His shoulders tightened. The instinct was immediate, the same one that had kept him alive through 15 years of riding with men who solved problems with their fists and their silence. Threat assessment, distance calculation, exit route. He turned slowly. A kid stood at the edge of the parking lot where the streetlight didn't reach, thin, soaking wet, shaking so badly his backpack straps were vibrating against his shoulders. One eye swollen completely shut, the skin around it already turning that ugly purple-black that meant someone had hit him with intent. His shoes were soaked through, the canvas separating from the soles. His jacket, some cheap polyester thing that had never been designed for weather like this, hung off his frame like a garbage bag. He couldn't have been more than 15. "Please," the kid said again, his voice cracking on the word like it cost him something physical to speak. "Can I sleep in your garage tonight?" Ryder stared at him. The rain hammered between them like a curtain neither of them could see through clearly. "No," Ryder said. He turned back to the chain. "I'll sleep on the floor." the kid said quickly, stepping forward. I won't touch anything. I'll be gone before sunrise. I can't be outside tonight. Not my problem. Please, I'm not asking for money or food or anything. Just the floor, just somewhere dry. Ryder threaded the chain through the last bar and reached for the padlock. His hands were shaking slightly, and he told himself it was the cold, just the cold. Where are your parents? He asked without turning around. Silence. Where'd you come from? More silence. Ryder turned again. The kid hadn't moved. He stood there in the rain like standing in the rain was the only thing he'd ever been taught to do. Water ran off his chin. His one good eye was locked on Ryder with an expression that was too old for his face, not begging, not manipulating, just calculating how many more seconds of rejection he could absorb before his legs gave out. Kid, I asked you a question. If they find me, the boy said quietly, I'm dead. The words hung in the rain. Ryder studied him, the swollen eye, the split lip that had been bleeding recently, the way he held his right arm close to his body like the ribs underneath were cracked. Then Ryder noticed the wrists. Red lines cut deep into the skin of both wrists, perfectly parallel, not cuts from a knife, not self-inflicted. These were pressure marks, ligature marks, zip ties. Someone had bound this kid's hands together recently enough that the welts were still raised and raw. Ryder's chest seized. For a moment he wasn't standing in the rain outside his garage in Coldwater. He was standing in the county morgue 7 years ago, looking down at his younger brother's body on a stainless steel table. Danny Vale, 29 years old, found dead in a motel room on Route 41, needle in his arm, officially ruled an overdose by the county coroner's office. Except Danny hadn't used drugs, not once in his life. And nobody, not the sheriff, not the coroner, not the state police, had been able to explain the bruises on Danny's wrists. The same kind of marks, the same width, the same depth. Ryder blinked. The morgue vanished. The rain returned. The kid was still standing there, still shaking, still waiting for the world to tell him no one more time. Ryder unlocked the padlock, pulled the chain free, shoved the side gate open with his shoulder. Don't touch my tools, he said, his voice flat and hard. Don't ask stupid questions, you're gone at sunrise. The kid nodded like he'd just been given something precious. Ryder led him through the side entrance into the back of the garage. The overhead fluorescents buzzed and flickered. The concrete floor was cold and oil-stained. Motorcycles in various states of surgery lined the walls like patients in a field hospital. He grabbed an old moving blanket from the parts room shelf and threw it at the kid without looking. Corner, stay out of the walkway. The boy caught the blanket with his good hand and moved to the far corner of the garage without another word. He set his torn backpack down carefully, too carefully, like whatever was inside mattered more than he did, and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders. Ryder watched from across the room. The kid didn't ask for water, didn't ask for food, didn't ask where the bathroom was. He just sat down on the concrete, pulled his knees to his chest, and closed his one working eye. Within 4 minutes, he was asleep. Just like that. Like unconsciousness was a survival skill he'd perfected. Ryder stood in the doorway between the garage and his back office for a long time. The coffee machine on his desk gurgled through its final cycle. Rain hammered the roof above him like fists on a coffin lid. He poured black coffee into a chipped mug and sat down at the desk. 3 security monitors showed grainy feeds from the cameras he'd installed after Danny's death. One covering the front lot, one covering the side gate, one covering the alley. He drank coffee and watched the screens. He told himself he was waiting for the kid to steal something so he'd have an excuse to throw him out. He told himself that's all it was. At 11:15 p.m., the kid hadn't moved. At midnight, still nothing. At 1:30 a.m., Ryder's eyes were burning. He refilled the coffee mug for the 4th time and rubbed his face with calloused hands. The rain had gotten worse. Wind shook the garage walls. A loose sheet of corrugated metal somewhere on the roof banged in a rhythm that sounded almost intentional, like someone knocking. He glanced at the feed from the back corner camera. The kid was curled into a ball on the concrete floor, the blanket pulled over his head. His body twitched every few seconds, the kind of twitching that came from dreams no one should have at 15. Ryder looked away. At 2:13 a.m., headlights appeared on the front camera. Ryder sat up. A vehicle had stopped on the street directly in front of the garage. Then a second one pulled up behind it. Then a third. 3 black SUVs. Engines running. Headlights cutting through the rain. Ryder set the coffee mug down slowly and leaned closer to the monitor. The driver's door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out. Big, heavy coat, moving with the kind of deliberate authority that came from years of never being questioned. He walked to the front of Ryder's garage and stood in the rain, scanning the building. Then 2 more men emerged from the second vehicle. One carried a flashlight. The other carried something that might have been a weapon under his jacket. They fanned out along the sidewalk, checking the perimeter. One of them tried the front bay door. Locked. Another walked to the side gate. Also locked. The man from the lead SUV pulled something from his coat. A radio. He spoke into it. Ryder couldn't hear the words through the camera feed, but he watched the man's mouth move, watched his head turn toward the garage, watched him point at the side alley where the gate was. Then the man turned slightly, and the camera caught the back of his jacket in the flickering neon light from Deacon's Liquor Mart. Mercer County Sheriff's Department. Ryder stopped breathing. He looked at the back corner camera. The kid was still asleep, still curled into that tight defensive ball, still twitching. He looked back at the front camera. The man with the sheriff's department jacket was walking back to the lead SUV. He leaned into the window and spoke to someone in the passenger seat. Then he nodded, got back in, and all 3 vehicles pulled away slowly. Not in a hurry, not panicked, just methodical. Like they had all the time in the world. Like they knew exactly what they were looking for and were simply narrowing the grid. They turned south on Route 41 and disappeared into the storm. Ryder sat in the darkness of his office for a long time. The monitors glowed. The coffee machine gurgled. The wind shook the walls. He reached under his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a Remington 870 shotgun that had belonged to Danny, a box of shells, and a photograph of 2 brothers standing next to a freshly built motorcycle, both of them grinning like the world made sense. Ryder loaded the shotgun. Then he sat back in the chair, the weapon across his lap, and watched the cameras until dawn. The kid woke at 5:47 a.m. Ryder watched it happen on the monitor. The boy unfolded from his corner slowly, painfully, like every joint had rusted overnight. He sat up and looked around the garage with his one good eye, orienting himself, remembering where he was and why. Then he reached for his backpack and clutched it against his chest. Ryder walked into the garage carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on the workbench near the kid without a word and leaned against the opposite wall, sipping from his own. The boy stared at the coffee like it was a foreign object. "Thank you," he whispered. "You said sunrise, sun's up." "I know." Neither of them moved. Ryder studied the boy in daylight. The damage was worse than he'd assessed in the dark. The swollen eye had turned a deep blackish purple overnight, the kind of bruising that spoke of repeated impact, not a single punch. There were marks on his neck too, faint but visible now in the gray morning light. Finger marks. Someone had grabbed this kid by the throat. "What's your name?" Ryder asked. The boy hesitated, calculated, decided something. "Eli." "Eli what?" Another pause. "Cross?" "Where'd you come from, Eli Cross?" The boy wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. The zip tie marks on his wrists were even more vivid now. Red, swollen, some of them crusted with dried blood where the plastic had cut through skin. "A transport van," Eli said quietly. "About 40 miles east on Route 41. Transport van. They call it a youth rehabilitation service. They pick kids up from shelters, group homes, bus stations. They tell you they're taking you somewhere better." "And where do they actually take you?" Eli's jaw tightened. He stared into the coffee. "Wherever the money says to take you." Ryder felt the temperature in the garage drop 10 degrees. "I got out 3 nights ago," Eli continued, his voice steady now, mechanical, like he'd rehearsed this speech in his head during the 40 miles of running. "There was a stop for fuel off 41. Driver left the back unlocked for maybe 90 seconds. I ran. And they've been looking for you since. They don't lose inventory." The word hit Ryder like a crowbar to the sternum. Inventory. I need to see those marks, Ryder said. Eli looked up. Your wrists. Let me see. Slowly, the boy extended his arms across the workbench. Ryder set his coffee down and took Eli's wrists in his hands. Gently, the way he handled precision engine components, the way he held things that mattered. The marks were deep. Uniform, made by heavy-gauge zip ties pulled tight enough to cut circulation. Both wrists showed identical patterns, meaning the boy had been bound with his hands together, likely for extended periods. Ryder released his grip and stepped back. There's a camera. Eli reached for his backpack with trembling fingers and unzipped the front pocket. He pulled out a battered disposable camera, the cheap cardboard kind that gas stations sold for $12. I stole it from a box in the van. Before I ran, I shot everything I could. Faces, plates, the route schedule they kept in the glove box. He held the camera like it was a grenade. Proof, Eli said, that they exist, that they're doing this, that he's running it. Who? Eli looked directly at Ryder with his one good eye. The sheriff. The word landed in the garage like a dropped engine block. Sheriff Tom Barrett, the man whose face smiled from campaign posters on every telephone pole in Mercer County. The man who attended every church pancake breakfast, every high school football game, every town council meeting with a firm handshake and a clean uniform. 32 years of service, re-elected 4 times without opposition. The most trusted man in Coldwater. The man whose department jacket Ryder had watched on security footage at 2:13 a.m. You need to leave, Ryder said. The words came out harder than he intended. Defensive. The voice of a man who'd already lost everyone he'd tried to protect and couldn't afford to try again. Take that camera. Go to the FBI field office in Columbus. It's 90 miles. Hitchhike if you have to. Show them the photos. They'll investigate. I already tried. Eli's voice was barely audible. Not Columbus, but the state police barracks in Marion. They called Barrett's office to verify my story while I was sitting in the lobby. 20 minutes later, 2 deputies showed up to take me into protective custody. He pulled back the collar of his jacket. On his left shoulder blade, visible through the torn polyester, was a bruise the size of a boot heel. Protective custody, Eli repeated. Ryder's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not my fight, kid. I know. I fix motorcycles. That's what I do. I don't save people. I know. You need to go. Eli stood up. He picked up his backpack, zipped the camera back inside, and walked toward the side gate without another word. No argument, no begging, just the quiet acceptance of someone who'd been told no so many times it had become background noise. He opened the gate and stepped into the gray morning. Ryder watched him go. Then he went back to his office, sat down, and stared at the security monitors. The coffee had gone cold. The shotgun still lay across his desk. Danny's photographs stared at him from beside the monitor. 2 brothers, 1 motorcycle, 1 moment when the world hadn't been broken yet. He lasted 10 minutes. Then he grabbed his jacket and his truck keys and drove toward the diner on Route 41 because that was the direction Eli had walked. And Ryder told himself he was going for breakfast. Just breakfast. Nothing else. He found Eli behind the Bluebird Diner. Not walking, not sitting. Lying face down in the gravel lot behind the dumpster, his backpack 3 feet away, its contents scattered across wet ground. The disposable camera lay cracked but intact near a puddle. 2 men were walking away fast, climbing into a dark sedan at the edge of the lot. No plates visible, both wearing plain clothes, both moving with trained efficiency. Ryder was out of the truck before it fully stopped. He knelt in the gravel and turned Eli over. The boy's face was a ruin. Both eyes swollen shut now, blood running from his nose and mouth. His breathing was shallow, ragged, the kind that came with fractured ribs. Eli. No response. Eli. A wet, choking sound. Then a whisper so faint Ryder had to press his ear to the boy's lips. Camera. Don't let them. Ryder grabbed the camera from the gravel, shoved it in his jacket, then he lifted Eli off the ground. The boy weighed nothing, absolutely nothing, just bones and bruises wrapped in wet polyester, and carried him to the truck. He drove back to the garage at 70 miles an hour with the boy unconscious in the passenger seat. blood staining the upholstery, the windshield wipers fighting a losing war against the rain. He pulled inside the bay, killed the engine, and bolted the doors shut from the inside. Then he stood in the middle of his dead brother's garage, holding an unconscious boy he'd known for less than 12 hours, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd spent 7 years welding shut. He laid Eli on the cot in the back office, cleaned the blood from his face with a shop rag soaked in warm water, checked his breathing, checked his pulse, pulled the blanket over him, and sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the wall. For a long time, the only sound was rain on the roof and the boy's labored breathing. Then Ryder pulled out his phone. He scrolled through contacts he hadn't touched in years, names from a previous life, people who'd ridden beside him through things that didn't make the news, people who understood that some debts couldn't be paid with money and some fights couldn't be won with lawyers. He called the first number. It rang 4 times. "Who the hell calls at 7 in the morning?" a woman's voice answered, rough with sleep and cigarette smoke. "Mara, it's Ryder." Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 5. "Ryder Vale, you've got to be kidding me. I need you. You need a therapist." "Mara." She heard it in his voice. Whatever she'd been about to say died in her throat. "What happened?" she asked. "Not on the phone. How fast can you get to Coldwater?" "Depends on how many laws you want me to break." "All of them." Another pause, then quieter. "Who's hurt?" "A kid." "How old?" 15. The line went silent for a long time. Ryder could hear her breathing change, the controlled, measured rhythm of someone who'd spent 3 combat tours keeping her hands steady while people bled out under her fingers. 3 hours, Mara said. "Don't let him die before I get there." Ryder made 2 more calls. Diesel Madden picked up on the first ring, said nothing, listened to everything, then hung up without a word. He'd be there? Vic Reno answered from somewhere that sounded like the inside of a machine, clanking metal, compressed air, the hum of industrial equipment. He asked one question. "How bad?" Ryder told him. Vic said he'd close the shop and drive through the night. Ryder put the phone down and looked at the boy on the cot. Eli's breathing had steadied slightly. His face was a swollen landscape of purple and black, but the bleeding had stopped. His hands, small, thin, scarred, clutched the edges of the blanket even in unconsciousness, like letting go of anything was a reflex he'd lost the ability to perform. Ryder reached under the desk and pulled out the disposable camera. He turned it over in his hands. Cheap cardboard casing, dented, water-damaged at one corner. A film advance wheel that still clicked when he turned it. The counter window showed 23 exposures used, 23 photographs, names, faces, license plates, routes, all sitting inside a $12 camera held by a 15-year-old boy that an entire county's law enforcement was trying to erase. Ryder set the camera in the desk drawer next to Danny's shotgun. Then he locked the drawer, pocketed the key, and sat back down on the floor. The rain outside had not stopped. It would not stop for 3 more days. At 10:14 that morning, while Eli still lay unconscious, Ryder turned on the small television mounted in the corner of the office, the one he only used to watch weather reports and the occasional football game. The local news was running a special bulletin. Sheriff Tom Barrett stood behind a podium bristling with microphones, his silver hair immaculate, his uniform pressed, his face arranged into an expression of grave concern that had been practiced in mirrors for 30 years. Asking the public's help in locating a juvenile fugitive, Eli Cross, age 15. The suspect is wanted in connection with the assault of a state-licensed youth transport officer during transit from a rehabilitation facility. The victim remains in critical condition. The suspect should be considered dangerous and unstable. Anyone with information. Ryder stared at the screen. Barrett's eyes were steady. His voice was measured. His hands rested on the podium like a man delivering a sermon about safety and order and the protection of children. Behind him, a photograph of Eli appeared on screen. A school photo, maybe 2 years old, the boy smiling slightly, before whatever had been done to him had carved the light from his face. Wanted, juvenile fugitive, assault, dangerous. The phone number for the sheriff's tip line scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Ryder turned off the television. He looked at the boy on the cot. Unconscious, broken, weighing less than a motorcycle engine. Dangerous. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He checked the security cameras. The parking lot was empty. The street was empty. The rain continued its assault on everything. But Ryder knew what was coming. Barrett had gone public. That meant the manhunt was official now. Search parties, roadblocks, every citizen in Mercer County with a phone becoming a surveillance camera. Every gas station clerk, every motel manager, every truck stop waitress turned into an informant for the most trusted lawman in the county. The boy had been invisible before. A runaway. A ghost. Now he was a target, and anyone sheltering him was an accessory. Ryder walked into the garage bay and stood among the skeletons of half-built motorcycles. Danny's old workbench still had his brother's handwriting on the pegboard above it. Part numbers, torque specs, a crude drawing of a custom exhaust system they'd designed together the year before Danny died. He pressed his palm flat against the pegboard. The wood was cold. "I'm sorry," he said to the empty garage. "I'm sorry I didn't see it." He didn't know if he was talking to Danny or to himself. At 1:30 that afternoon, Eli woke up screaming. Ryder was across the room in 3 strides. He caught the boy's wrists before Eli could tear the stitches Ryder had improvised from a fishing kit, held him against the cot, spoke low and steady the way you'd talk to a wounded animal. "You're in the garage. You're safe. Nobody's here but me." Eli's one working eye was wild, unfocused, trapped somewhere between the cot and whatever nightmare had followed him out of sleep. "Lucy!" he gasped. "They have Lucy!" "Who's Lucy?" The boy's chest was heaving. Tears cut tracks through the dried blood on his face. "My sister. She's 12. She's still in the van. She's still inside." Ryder's grip on Eli's wrist loosened. "There are others?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "There are always others," Eli said. His voice broke on the last word, shattered like glass thrown against concrete. "But Lucy's mine. She's my responsibility. I was supposed to come back for her. I promised I'd come back." He looked at Ryder with an expression that no 15-year-old should be capable of producing. Not desperation, not fear, but the weight of a promise that was too heavy for his bones to carry. "I didn't escape for me," Eli whispered. "I escaped to get help. I escaped so someone would believe me, so someone would go back for her." The garage was silent, except for the rain. Ryder released Eli's wrists and stepped back. He leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes. A 12-year-old girl, somewhere on Route 41. Inside a van operated by men who called children inventory, protected by a sheriff who murdered witnesses and staged overdoses. He thought about Danny. He thought about the morgue. He thought about the 7 years he'd spent telling himself there was nothing he could have done. And for the first time since he'd stood over his brother's body, Ryder Vale understood what he was actually supposed to do with whatever broken years he had left. He opened his eyes. "When my people get here," he said, "you're going to tell them everything. Every face you saw, every route, every name, everything." Eli stared at him. "And then we're going to find your sister." The boy's breathing stopped. His one good eye searched Ryder's face for the lie, for the revision, for the moment the adult would take it back the way every adult in his life had always taken it back. He didn't find it. Outside, the first engine rumble cut through the rain. Deep, unmistakable, a V-twin throttling down as it turned off Route 41 toward the garage. Mara Quinn had arrived. And behind her, still an hour out, 2 more engines were closing distance. Ryder Vale hadn't ridden with a crew in 7 years, hadn't trusted anyone to watch his back since the night he'd identified his brother's body, hadn't believed that broken people could do anything but break further. But standing in that garage, watching a beaten boy hold a disposable camera like a weapon and whisper his sister's name like a prayer to no one, Ryder felt the old machinery turning inside him again. Not rage, not revenge, something worse. Purpose. And across town, in the limestone building that housed the Mercer County Sheriff's Department, Tom Barrett sat in his private office watching the same security camera feeds that covered every block of Main Street. His desk phone rang. He answered it, listened, set it down. Then he opened his bottom drawer, removed a folder marked Veil, Daniel, closed, and fed it page by page into the shredder beside his desk. The machine hummed. The paper disappeared. And somewhere in the storm between them, the war had already begun, even though only one side knew it yet. Mara Quinn killed the engine of her Indian Scout bobber in the middle of Ryder's parking lot and sat on the bike for a full minute before dismounting. She didn't rush, never had. 3 combat tours in Afghanistan had burned the urgency out of her nervous system and replaced it with something colder. A calculated stillness that made people uncomfortable because they couldn't tell if she was thinking or targeting. 41 years old, lean, hard-angled, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and hands that could suture a wound or pick a lock with equal precision. A faded tattoo of a medical caduceus wrapped around her left forearm, half covered by a leather riding glove she never removed in public because the scars underneath invited questions she'd stopped answering years ago. She wore a black canvas jacket over a thermal, riding boots that had seen more miles than most cars, and carried a military surplus medic bag slung across her back that weighed 32 pounds and contained everything needed to keep a human being alive for 72 hours outside a hospital. Ryder opened the side gate. They looked at each other across 7 years of silence. "You look like hell," Mara said. "You look the same. That's worse than hell, and you know it." She didn't smile. Neither did he. But something loosened between them, the invisible cable of shared history going slack enough to let them breathe in the same space again. Mara walked into the garage, her eyes sweeping the room with the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd spent years entering buildings where the architecture wanted to kill her. She clocked the exits, the windows, the sightlines from the street. Then her gaze landed on the back office, on the cot, on the shape line under the blanket. She set the medic bag on the workbench and unzipped it without a word. "How long has he been out?" she asked, pulling on nitrile gloves. "Woke up once around 1:30, screaming, went back under about 20 minutes later. Coherent when he was up? Enough to tell me his sister's still inside." Mara's hand stopped moving, just for a second. Then they resumed, pulling out gauze, antiseptic, a pen light, a blood pressure cuff. "How old?" "The sister? 12. Mara said nothing. She walked into the back office and knelt beside the cot with the pen light in her teeth and began her assessment. Ryder watched from the doorway as she peeled back the blanket, checked Eli's pupils, pressed gently along his ribcage, examined the wrist wounds. Her face didn't change. Not once. But Ryder had ridden with Mara long enough to read the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw muscles flexed when she found something she didn't like. 2 fractured ribs, maybe 3, she said, her voice clinical. Concussion, moderate. The wrist lacerations need proper cleaning, but they're not infected yet. The facial swelling's ugly, but structural damage seems minimal. She paused. There are older marks under his shirt. Bruising in different stages of healing, weeks old, some of them. This wasn't a one-time thing. I know. He's been beaten systematically, regularly. I know, Mara. She looked up at him. The penlight threw hard shadows across her face. What exactly are we walking into? Ryder told her. Everything, the transport van, the camera, Barrett, the 2:13 a.m. visit, the news broadcast, the manhunt. Mara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she pulled off the nitrile gloves and dropped them in the trash. You're asking me to go to war with a sitting county sheriff, she said. I'm asking you to help me keep a kid alive. That's the same thing and you know it. Ryder didn't argue. Mara stood up, crossed her arms, and leaned against the office wall. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed above her like an insect trapped in glass. I've been clean for 14 months, she said quietly. No tables, no cards, no online. 14 months without putting a bet on anything. Ryder waited. This would be the biggest gamble I've ever taken. It's not a gamble, it's a choice. Don't philosophize at me, Ryder. I've seen what happens to people who make choices like this. I spent 3 tours watching them get loaded into body bags. She pushed off the wall and walked to the garage bay window, looking out at the rain. And I've spent the last 7 years trying to convince myself I'm not one of those people anymore. You've always been one of those people. That's why I called you. Mara turned around. Her eyes were hard, bright, the eyes of someone running calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics. Who else is coming? Diesel. Vic. Diesel I trust. Vic. She trailed off, her mouth tightening. What about Vic? Vic Reno did 18 months in Chillicothe for running contraband through the same trucking corridors you're talking about. You know that. He was moving stolen auto parts, not people. He was moving things for people who moved people. There's a food chain rider, and Vic knows every link in it because he used to be one. The accusation hung in the garage like exhaust fumes. That's exactly why I need him, Ryder said. Or it's exactly why Barrett will use him to find us. Before Ryder could respond, the rumble of a massive diesel engine shook the garage walls. Through the security monitor, they watched a flatbed tow truck the size of a small building pull into the lot, its chrome stacks belching black smoke into the rain. Diesel Madden. The truck door opened, and a man who looked like he'd been assembled from bridge cables and concrete stepped down into the parking lot. 6'5", 270 pounds, none of it decorative, a red beard that hadn't been trimmed since the last presidential election, and hands that could bend a tire iron into a U-shape, which Ryder had personally watched him do during a roadside dispute in 2016. Diesel walked into the garage, water streaming off his canvas duster. He looked at Ryder. He looked at Mara. He looked at the office, at the cot, at the small shape underneath the blanket. He didn't speak. He pulled a thermos from his coat, poured black coffee into the cap, and drank it standing in the middle of the bay with rainwater pooling around his boots. Then he walked to the office doorway, looked at Eli for a long moment, and turned back to Ryder. He raised his eyebrows. That was his question. "I'll explain when Vic gets here," Ryder said. Diesel shrugged and went back to his coffee. Mara watched the exchange with visible irritation. "He's not even going to ask what he's doing here?" "He doesn't need to," Ryder said. "I called. He came." "That's not loyalty, Ryder. That's habit, and habits get people killed." The tension between them was palpable. Two people who respected each other enough to be honest and resented each other enough to mean it. Vic Reno arrived at 4:17 p.m. in a rusted Chevy Silverado that sounded like it was dying of emphysema. He was smaller than the others, wiry, quick, with sharp features and nervous eyes that never stopped moving. A prison tattoo on his neck that he covered with a bandana when he remembered. 44 years old and looked 60, the way men who'd done hard time always looked older than their years, because incarceration didn't pause the clock. It accelerated it. He walked into the garage smelling like motor oil and Marlboros, shook Ryder's hand, nodded at Diesel, and stopped cold when he saw Mara. "Quinn." "Reno." The temperature dropped. "Didn't know she was part of this," Vic said to Ryder, not taking his eyes off Mara. "She's part of this. Last time we were in the same room, she told me I was the reason good people die in bad systems." "I stand by that statement," Mara said. "Great. Beautiful reunion." Vic turned to Ryder. "What's the job?" Ryder laid it out. All of it. The boy. The operation. The camera. Barrett. By the time he finished, the four of them were standing around the workbench under the harsh fluorescent lights, coffee mugs and silence between them. Vic was the first to speak. "Barrett's trafficking operation runs through the Route 41 corridor," he said, and the fact that he said it without surprise told Ryder everything he needed to know. "I've known about it for years." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded violence. "Excuse me?" Mara's voice was lethally quiet. "I didn't know what it was," Vic said quickly. "Not specifically. When I was inside, guys talked about a pipeline running through Mercer County, moving things nobody was supposed to see. I thought it was drugs, weapons maybe. I didn't know it was kids." "You didn't know," Mara repeated. "Or you didn't ask." "I was surviving an 18-month sentence in a facility where asking questions got your teeth knocked into your soup. So no, Quinn, I didn't ask. I kept my head down, did my time, and got out." "And you never thought to mention this to anyone after?" "Mention what? A rumor from a cell block? To who? The cops? The same cops running the pipeline?" Diesel set his coffee thermos down on the workbench with a heavy clank. Everyone stopped talking. He looked at Vic, then at Mara, then at Ryder. He shook his head once. "Not now." Ryder understood. "We deal with what's in front of us, not what's behind us." "Vic, can you trace the route?" Vic rubbed the back of his neck, the prison tattoo stretching as his muscles tensed. If the kid's camera has what you say it has, I can probably reconstruct the corridor. Pickup points, transfer stations, fuel stops. Barrett's not running this out of the sheriff's office. He needs infrastructure. Warehouses, depots, places where trucks can sit for hours without attracting attention. The old freight depot, Mara said suddenly. South of town, off County Road 9. It's been abandoned since the grain co-op closed. That's the one everyone thinks is abandoned, Vic corrected. I drove past it 2 months ago, at night. There were lights on inside and fresh tire tracks in the yard. Another revelation, another layer peeled back from the rotting surface of a town that had been dying in ways nobody wanted to name. Okay, Ryder said. We need the film from that camera developed. Mara, can you handle that? I need a dark room, or at minimum a light-tight space in chemistry. The camera is disposable. It's standard C41 process film. I can develop it in the bathroom if I have the chemicals. Order whatever you need. Use cash, nothing digital. There's a photography supply place in Lima, Mara said. 45 minutes. I can be back by 8. Take the back roads. Barrett's got roadblocks on 41. Mara grabbed her jacket and helmet. She paused at the door. Ryder. He looked up. If those photos are what the kid says they are, we can't undevelop them. The second we see what's on that film, we're in this. All the way. No walking it back. I know. Do you? Because in 36 hours, every law enforcement agency in this county is going to be looking for the people harboring a fugitive minor, and that's us. I know, Mara. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she walked out into the rain, and 30 seconds later, the growl of her Indian scout faded into the storm. The next 3 hours were the quietest and most tense of Ryder's life. Diesel stationed himself near the front bay, sitting on an overturned engine block with a socket wrench in his hand, watching the street through a gap in the corrugated wall. He hadn't spoken a single word since arriving. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a perimeter. Vic paced. He smoked 3 cigarettes in the garage bay with the side door cracked 2 inches, the cold rain misting in across the concrete floor. Between cigarettes, he examined Ryder's security camera setup with the quick appraising eye of someone who'd spent years identifying gaps in surveillance systems. Your cameras are garbage, he said. They work. They work for watching raccoons raid your dumpster. Barrett's people will know about them already. They'll approach from the blind spots. What blind spots? Vic pointed. North side between the dumpster and the propane cage. The alley camera doesn't cover the first 15 feet past the fence, and your back lot has 0 coverage. Someone could walk right up to the rear wall without triggering anything. Ryder stared at the monitors. Vic was right. He'd installed the cameras to feel safe, not to actually be safe. The difference was suddenly enormous. I've got 2 trail cams in the truck, Vic said. Motion activated, infrared. I'll set them up before dark. Where'd you get trail cams? Vic looked at him flatly. I hunt? You live in an apartment above a muffler shop. I hunt, Vic repeated, and the conversation was over. While Vic worked on the cameras, Ryder sat in the office and watched Eli sleep. The boy's breathing had improved, deeper, more regular, but his face was a topographic map of violence, every bruise a contour line marking a different altitude of pain. The small television in the corner was off. Ryder had unplugged it. He didn't need to see Barrett's face again, didn't need to hear the word dangerous attached to this kid one more time. Instead, he opened the bottom desk drawer and pulled out Danny's file. Not the official file. That had been sealed by the county years ago. This was Ryder's file. A manila envelope stuffed with everything he'd collected in the months after Danny's death. Newspaper clippings, phone records he'd obtained through methods he never discussed, a hand-drawn map of Route 41 with red circles marking every location where Danny had been seen in his final weeks. And at the bottom of the envelope, a single photograph. Danny Vale, 29 years old, standing outside an abandoned freight depot on County Road 9, the same depot Vic had just mentioned. The photograph was time-stamped 11 days before Danny died. Ryder's hands trembled as he held it under the desk lamp. In the photograph, Danny was pointing at something off-camera. His expression wasn't afraid. It was furious, determined. The face of a young man who'd discovered something monstrous and intended to drag it into the light. 11 days later, he was dead on a motel room floor with a needle in his arm that somebody else had put there. Ryder closed the envelope and pressed his palms flat against the desk until the trembling stopped. He'd spent 7 years assuming Danny had stumbled into something random. Wrong place, wrong time. The bitter, comfortable narrative of meaningless tragedy. But it wasn't random. Danny had found the same operation, the same corridor, the same depot, and Barrett had killed him for it. The realization was not a detonation. It was a slow, structural collapse, like watching a building's foundation crack in real time, every beam and joist shifting, the whole architecture of grief and guilt he'd built over 7 years suddenly revealing itself as a lie. Danny hadn't died because Ryder failed to protect him. Danny had died because he'd been brave enough to try to protect someone else. And now, 7 years later, a 15-year-old boy was lying on a cot in the same garage, carrying the same evidence, hunted by the same man, asking for the same thing Danny had never gotten: someone to stand beside him. At 8:22 p.m., Mara returned. She came through the side gate, shaking rain from her jacket, carrying a paper bag of darkroom chemicals and a roll of black plastic sheeting. Without stopping to talk, she went into the bathroom, taped the plastic over the window and door gaps, and began setting up processing trays in the sink. Ryder brought her the camera. "Don't watch," she said. "The room needs to stay dark for the first stage. I'll call you when there's something to see." He waited in the office. An hour later, Mara emerged carrying a strip of wet negatives held up to the fluorescent light with surgical forceps. Her face was white. "Ryder?" He stood up. She hung the negative strip from a clothesline she'd rigged across the workbench and positioned the desk lamp behind it. The images were small, inverted, ghostly, but clear enough. 23 exposures. The first 6 showed the interior of a transport van, metal benches bolted to the walls, restraint points welded to the floor, no windows, a partition between the cargo area and the cab. On one bench, barely visible in the negative's reverse tones, the shapes of small human figures, children, sitting in rows, hands bound, heads down. Exposures 7 through 12 showed faces, adults, men in plain clothes standing beside the van at what appeared to be a fuel stop. One of them was handing a clipboard to another. License plates were visible on 3 different vehicles in the background. Exposure 13 stopped everyone cold. It showed a man in a khaki uniform standing beside the open rear doors of the van, his hand on the shoulder of a small girl who was being led out. His face was turned 3/4 toward the camera. Sheriff Tom Barrett. The image was unmistakable. The silver hair, the badge, the departmental insignia on the jacket, and the girl he was gripping by the shoulder was small, dark-haired, maybe 12 years old. From behind Ryder, a sound. He turned. Eli stood in the office doorway, blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his swollen face barely visible in the dim light. He was looking at the negative strip, at exposure 13. "That's Lucy," he said. His voice was hollow, empty. The voice of someone who'd run out of tears 3 states ago and had nothing left but the words themselves. "That's my sister." Mara looked at Ryder. Diesel, who had materialized silently behind Eli, looked at Ryder. Vic, standing in the shadows by the side door, with an unlit cigarette between his lips, looked at Ryder. Everyone was looking at Ryder, and Ryder was looking at the photograph of Tom Barrett holding a 12-year-old girl by the shoulder outside a transport van in the dark. "Mara," he said, "how many copies can you make?" "As many as you need." "Make 12. Hide them in 12 different locations. If anything happens to us, those photos need to survive." "I can do better than that," Vic said from the shadows. "I know a guy in Dayton who runs a dead drop network for whistleblowers. Former journalist. Encrypted digital storage. If we scan these and get them to him, Barrett can burn this garage to the ground and it won't matter. Do it." Vic nodded and disappeared through the side door into the rain. Mara began carefully removing the negatives from the clothesline. "We need to move fast. Barrett's not stupid. He knows the kid had the camera. He knows the film hasn't been developed yet. Or at least he's hoping it hasn't. Once he realizes we have physical evidence, he won't send deputies next time." "What will he send?" Eli asked. Nobody answered him. They didn't need to. At 11 o'clock that night, the local news ran an updated bulletin. Ryder watched it on Mara's phone because the office television was still unplugged. Barrett stood at the same podium, but the tone had changed. The fatherly concern was gone. In its place was something colder, more administrative. Expanding the search radius to include all properties along the Route 41 corridor. We have reason to believe the fugitive may be receiving assistance from local individuals. Anyone found harboring this suspect will face federal obstruction charges. Then Barrett looked directly into the camera. I want to speak to the people of Mercer County. This boy is not a victim. He is a violent offender who attacked a state employee and fled lawful custody. If someone in this community is hiding him, I need you to understand what you are not helping him. You are endangering this town. The broadcast cut to footage of deputies setting up checkpoints on Route 41. Then something new. A photograph appeared on screen. Not Eli's photo this time. Ryder's. An old mugshot from 12 years ago. The arrest that had ended his riding days. Aggravated assault. Charges eventually dropped, but the photograph remained in the system. His face, younger but unmistakable, staring into the camera with the flat, empty expression of a man who'd stopped caring about consequences. Persons of interest include Ryder Vale, owner of Vale Brothers Custom Motorcycle Repair, who has a documented history of violent criminal behavior. Barrett had connected them. Somehow, already, Barrett knew. Mara took the phone back and turned it off. The garage was silent. How? Ryder said. How does he know? Vic's voice came from the doorway. He'd returned from the side lot, rain dripping from his bandana, his face unreadable. Because someone told him. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to Vic. Not me, he said immediately, his hands rising. But think about it. Barrett had your face on the news within 8 hours of the kid showing up. He didn't get that from surveillance. He got it from intelligence. Someone in this town saw the kid enter your garage last night, and they called it in. Nobody saw him, Ryder said. It was 2 a.m, pouring rain. Somebody saw something, a neighbor, a passing car. The liquor store has cameras. Mara's voice was sharp. Or someone in this room made a call they shouldn't have. The accusation detonated silently. Vic's face went rigid. You want to say that to me directly, Quinn? I just did. I drove 3 hours through a storm to be here. I set up your security perimeter. I'm the one connecting you to a dead-drop network that could keep your evidence alive. And you're accusing me of being a rat? I'm pointing out that you spent 18 months inside a facility run by people connected to Barrett's operation, and now Barrett knows exactly where we are. Diesel stood up from the engine block. The socket wrench in his hand caught the light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His standing was the statement. Ryder stepped between them. Enough. It's not enough, Mara said, her voice vibrating with controlled fury. We're sitting in a building whose address just got broadcast on every television in Mercer County, and one of us has a direct connection to the network we're trying to dismantle. That's not paranoia, Ryder. That's operational reality. I said enough. The words hit the walls and died. Vic stared at Mara for a long, electric moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up, screen facing out. Call log. Check it. Every number I've dialed in the last 72 hours. Check it right now. Mara didn't move. Check it, Quinn. She took the phone, scrolled through the log. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. The faintest recalibration of certainty. She handed the phone back without a word. We good? Vic asked. We're functional, Mara said. Good is a long way from here. Ryder let the silence settle. Then, Barrett knows where we are. That means we have hours, not days. Vic, the freight depot. Can you get us inside? I can get us close. The depot's got a fence, security lights, probably cameras. But the real problem isn't getting in. It's what happens when Barrett realizes we've been there. The real problem, Eli's voice came from the office doorway, weak but steady, is that the convoy moves every 72 hours. Everyone turned. Eli leaned against the doorframe, the blanket around his shoulders like a shroud. His one good eye was focused, alert, burning with something that had nothing to do with fever. They never keep the kids in one place more than 3 days. The van I was in, We stopped at 4 different locations in 2 weeks. The depot is just a way station. If Lucy was there when I escaped, she might still be there now, but not for much longer. How do you know the 72-hour cycle? Mara asked. Because I counted. Every time we moved, I counted the hours. 72, sometimes 70, never more than 75. The precision of it hit Ryder like a physical blow. This boy had been counting hours inside a transport van, bound at the wrists, cataloging the rhythm of his own captivity because it was the only weapon available to him. When did you escape? Ryder asked. 3 nights ago. The math detonated in the room. 3 nights. 72 hours. If the cycle held, the convoy was moving tonight, maybe tomorrow morning at the latest. Lucy was about to disappear. We go now, Ryder said. We're not ready, Mara said. We don't have time to be ready. Ryder, we have no plan, no recon, no tactical approach. We don't even know how many men Barrett has at that depot. Walking in blind is how people die. Staying here is how that little girl vanishes into a system we'll never find her in again. You want to talk about operational reality? That's reality. 72 hours. The garage fell silent again. Diesel picked up his socket wrench, inspected it like it was a weapon, which, in his hands, it was, and walked toward the tow truck without a word. That was his vote. Vic pulled the unlit cigarette from his lips and crushed it in his palm. I can get us to the depot's east fence line without being seen. There's an old service road that runs through the tree line, not on any map. How do you know about a road that's not on any map? Mara asked. Vic looked at her. Because I used to use it. When I was moving things I shouldn't have been moving. Through places I shouldn't have been. He paused. You want to judge me for that, Quinn? You can do it on the drive. But that road is the reason we can get within 100 yards of that depot without Barrett's cameras picking us up. Mara stared at him for a long time. Long. Then she walked to her medic bag, pulled out a compact Mossberg shotgun that had been broken down and hidden beneath the gauze rolls, and began assembling it on the workbench with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in worse conditions. Fine, she said, but we do this smart. Vic takes point on approach. Diesel provides vehicular support and extraction. I handle medical and rear security. She looked at Ryder. You handle Barrett. And me? Eli asked. You stay here, 4 voices said simultaneously. The boy's jaw tightened. She's my sister. And you have 2 fractured ribs, a concussion, and 1 working eye, Mara said. You're not an asset on this. You're a liability. The word hit Eli like a slap. He flinched, physically flinched, and for one terrible moment the hardened survivor disappeared, and there was just a 15-year-old boy standing in a garage surrounded by adults who were deciding his sister's fate without him. I'm not staying behind, he said. Not again. Kid, Ryder started. They took her because of me. She was in that van because I couldn't protect her. I tried. I tried to keep us together and I failed. And now you're telling me to sit in this garage and wait while strangers go looking for her? His voice cracked. She doesn't know you. She doesn't trust adults. She won't go with you. She'll fight you. She'll scream, and Barrett's people will hear her. He swallowed hard. She'll only go with me. The truth of it settled across the room like a physical weight. Mara closed her eyes. Diesel stopped walking. Vic lit a fresh cigarette and inhaled until the ember reached his fingertips. Ryder looked at the boy. 15 years old, broken, barely standing, carrying the kind of courage that had gotten his brother killed 7 years ago in the same town, on the same road, fighting the same monster. You stay behind me, Ryder said, every second. You don't speak unless I tell you to. You don't move unless I move first. You do exactly what I say, when I say it. No arguments, no heroics. Eli nodded. And if I tell you to run, you run. You don't look back. Not for me. Not for anyone. You grab your sister and you run until your legs give out. Understood? Understood. Ryder picked up Danny's shotgun from the desk. He checked the chamber, loaded 4 shells, felt the weight of it in his hands, the weight of his brother's absence, the weight of 7 years of unanswered questions, the weight of a choice he couldn't undo. He walked to the garage bay and unlocked the front door. The rain had stopped. For the first time in 3 days, the sky over Coldwater was clear. Cold. Stars visible through the thinning clouds like puncture wounds in dark fabric. The silence was worse than the storm. Ryder looked at his crew. A gambling addict combat medic, a silent giant, a convicted smuggler, and a battered child, standing in the fluorescent light of a dead man's garage, about to drive into the darkness towards something none of them might drive back from. He thought about turning around, locking the gate, calling the FBI, doing this the right way. Then he thought about a 12-year-old girl counting hours inside a metal box, waiting for a brother who promised he'd come back. Ryder started his motorcycle. The engine split the night open like a blade. And out on County Road 9, less than 11 miles south, a convoy of 3 unmarked trucks was already warming its engines behind the razor wire fence of the freight depot, preparing to move its cargo before dawn to a destination that existed on no map, in no system, in no record that any court would ever see. The clock had been at 0 for hours. They just didn't know it yet. They took County Road 9 with their headlights off. Ryder rode point on the Sportster he'd rebuilt last week, the engine throttled down to a low growl that barely rose above the sound of tires on wet gravel. Behind him, Vic's Silverado crept along with Eli in the passenger seat, the boy's face a pale smudge behind the rain-streaked windshield. Mara rode 50 yards back on the Indian Scout, the Mossberg strapped across her back in a makeshift sling she'd fashioned from a cargo strap. And behind them all, Diesel's flatbed tow truck rolled through the darkness like a steel cathedral on wheels, its running lights taped over with black electrical tape, its diesel engine barely idling. The old service road Vic had described cut through a tree line of dead oaks and neglected fence posts, running parallel to the depot's eastern perimeter for roughly 300 yards, before disappearing into a drainage culvert choked with weeds and rusted agricultural equipment. They stopped at the culvert. Ryder killed the engine and dismounted. The cold hit him immediately, the kind of Midwestern November cold that got inside your chest and stayed there, pressing against your lungs with every breath. His boots sank into mud as he walked to Vic's truck and tapped on the window. Vic rolled it down 2 inches. "East fence is through those trees," Vic whispered. "About 100 yards. The cameras are mounted on the light poles at the north and south corners. There's a gap in coverage along the east side where the pole went down in a windstorm 2 years ago. Never replaced." "How do you know it was never replaced?" Vic's jaw tightened. "Because I checked, 2 months ago, when I drove past." Ryder didn't ask why Vic had been checking security gaps at a supposedly abandoned freight depot 2 months ago. There wasn't time. And the answer might be something he couldn't afford to hear right now. "Stay with the kid," Ryder said. "Mara and I go on foot. Diesel holds the extraction point here." "Ryder," Vic's voice was barely audible. "If they're loading trucks, there'll be drivers, security, maybe armed escorts. This isn't a rescue mission anymore. This is a raid." "I know what it is." He walked to the tree line with Mara beside him. She moved through the underbrush without sound, her boots finding solid ground by instinct, the medic bag tight against her back, the shotgun in her hands. They reached the fence in 4 minutes. Chain link, 8 feet, topped with razor wire that gleamed in the distant light from the depot's sodium floods. Through the links, Ryder could see the facility clearly for the first time. It wasn't abandoned. 3 large warehouse bays faced a central loading yard. Floodlights mounted on steel poles threw harsh white light across cracked concrete. 2 box trucks sat backed up to the center bay, their rear doors open. A third truck, larger, a full semi-trailer rig, idled near the north exit gate with its running lights on. Men moved between the vehicles, 4 that Ryder could count, maybe more inside the bays. They wore plain clothes, dark jackets, work boots, and moved with the efficiency of people performing a routine they'd executed many times before, and parked near the main office door, a black Mercer County Sheriff's SUV. "Barrett's here," Mara breathed. Ryder's grip on the fence links tightened until the metal bit into his palms. Through the open bay of the center warehouse, he could see movement, shapes, small shapes being guided, herded, from the building toward the waiting trucks. Children. Even at this distance, even through the chain link and the floodlights and the cold, he could see them. 5, maybe 6 small figures moving in a line, heads down, hands at their sides, walking in the shuffling, defeated gait of people who'd stopped expecting rescue. Mara's breathing changed beside him, shorter, controlled, the combat medic's physiological override kicking in, shutting down the emotional response to preserve function. "I count 4 adults in the yard," she said, "probably 2 more inside. Barrett's vehicle means at least 1 deputy, maybe 2. I see the trucks. The semi's the transport. The box trucks are staging. They'll transfer the kids to the semi for long-distance movement. Standard trafficking logistics." "Since when do you know trafficking logistics?" "Since I spent 6 months at a VA hospital next to an FBI task force office. You hear things." She paused. "Ryder, there are too many of them. We're 4 people and a kid with broken ribs. I'm not leaving." "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to think." He was thinking. He was thinking about Danny's photograph. His brother standing outside the same depot, pointing at something off camera 11 days before someone put a needle in his arm. He was thinking about Eli's voice saying she's my sister with the hollow certainty of someone who'd already accepted that the world wouldn't help. He was thinking about 72 hours and how many of those hours had already burned away while they argued in a garage. "Vic's service road connects to the north gate," Ryder said. "If Diesel can get the flatbed to that gate, he can block the semi's exit. And then what? Barrett's men will be on us in seconds. That's where you come in. I need a distraction, something loud enough to pull security toward the east fence while I go in through the north." Mara stared at him. "You want me to draw fire. I want you to create chaos." "Those are the same thing, Ryder." He met her eyes through the darkness. 20 minutes. Give me 20 minutes inside that depot. If I'm not out with the kids by then, take Eli and drive. Don't stop until you reach Columbus." "And what about you?" "I'll be out in 20 minutes. "You don't know that." "No, I don't." They looked at each other across the impossible distance between certainty and faith. Mara nodded once. They moved back through the tree line to the culvert. Ryder laid out the plan in whispered fragments. Diesel to the north gate, Mara creating a diversion at the east fence, Vic bringing the Silverado around to the south as a secondary extraction vehicle. Eli listened to all of it in silence. "I'm going in with you," he said when Ryder finished. "We talked about this. Lucy won't go with a stranger. I told you that. She'll scream and fight and they'll hear her. I'll figure it out. You won't. She's been in that system for 4 months. She doesn't trust men she doesn't know. The last time a man she didn't know pulled her out of a vehicle, he put her in a worse one. You walk in there looking like you look, she's going to think you're one of them." The logic was devastating because it was true. Ryder looked at Mara. She gave him nothing. No nod, no shake, no guidance. This was his call. "Behind me," Ryder said to Eli. "Every second. Every second." They separated into positions. Diesel moved the flatbed north through the tree line, the massive truck somehow near silent as it crept along the dirt service road in first gear. Mara positioned herself at the east fence with a road flare she'd pulled from the Silverado's emergency kit, and the Mossberg loaded with 4 shells. Vic circled south in the truck, headlights still off, engine barely turning over. Ryder and Eli approached the north gate on foot. The gate was padlocked, industrial grade. Ryder examined it in the darkness with his fingers. Heavy shackle, hardened steel, the kind that required a bolt cutter or a key. He didn't have either, but he had Danny's shotgun. He pressed the muzzle against the padlock, angled away from himself and Eli, and waited. The seconds stretched like wire. Then, from the east side of the depot, a brilliant red light erupted through the darkness. Mara's road flare, arcing over the east fence and landing in the loading yard like a fallen star. Voices shouted, flashlight beams swept east, boots pounded concrete. Ryder pulled the trigger, the padlock exploded. The blast echoed off the warehouse walls, swallowed almost immediately by the chaos erupting at the east perimeter. Ryder kicked the gate open and moved through with Eli pressed against his back, the boy's hand gripping the rear of Ryder's jacket with white-knuckle force. They were inside. The north side of the depot was a narrow corridor between the outer fence and the rear wall of the main warehouse. Loading pallets stacked against the wall, industrial waste bins, broken crates. The ground was slick with oil and standing water. Ryder heard the second sound he'd been waiting for, Mara's shotgun, A concussive blast that rolled across the depot like artificial thunder, followed by the sharp crack of shattering floodlight glass. She was taking out the light poles, plunging sections of the yard into darkness. A second blast. Another light died. Shouting intensified. More boots, more flashlights. Ryder moved along the rear wall toward a service entrance he'd identified from the fence. A metal door with a push bar, the kind found on emergency exits in commercial buildings. He reached it, pushed, locked from inside. He looked at Eli. The boy was scanning the wall with his one good eye, cataloging every detail the way only someone who'd been imprisoned inside buildings like this could. His gaze stopped on a row of corrugated ventilation panels near the roofline, roughly 8 feet up. "Third panel from the left," Eli whispered. "The screws are stripped. I watched them repair it at the last depot. They never tighten the vents because the drivers smoke inside and need airflow." Ryder looked up. The panel was small. Too small for him, but not too small for a 15-year-old. "No," Ryder said. "Boost me up. I'll drop inside, unlock the door from the other side." "Absolutely not. 30 seconds, that's all I need." Another shotgun blast from the east fence. More shouting. A vehicle engine roared to life somewhere in the yard. Someone trying to move the trucks. They were running out of time. Ryder crouched down, made a step with his interlocked hands. Eli placed his boot in Ryder's palms, and Ryder lifted him, his shoulders screaming, until the boy could reach the vent panel. Eli pulled it free with one hand. The corrugated metal peeled away silently. He gripped the edge of the opening, pulled himself up and through with a hiss of pain from his fractured ribs, and disappeared into the darkness inside the building. Ryder stood alone in the cold, shotgun pointed at the service door, counting seconds. 1, 2, 3, 10, 15. At 22 seconds, the push bar clicked from inside and the door swung open. Eli stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face twisted with pain. "They're in the back bay," he said. "I could hear them." Ryder entered the warehouse. The interior was vast, concrete-floored, lit by industrial fixtures that cast pools of white light separated by trenches of deep shadow. Equipment lined the walls. Shelving units, shipping containers, pallets stacked with unmarked boxes. The air smelled like diesel exhaust, cold metal, and something underneath it all that Ryder recognized from the VA hospital, where he'd spent 6 weeks after a wreck in 2014. The sour, chemical smell of fear. The smell of people who'd been confined in small spaces for too long. They moved through the warehouse in tandem. Ryder leading, shotgun up. Eli 3 steps behind, one hand on the wall for balance, navigating by memory and instinct. Voices ahead. Low, businesslike. The sound of metal doors being operated. Slide, clang, slide. Ryder pressed against a shelving unit and peered around the edge. The back bay was a loading area. 2 box trucks backed up to roll-up doors, and between them, standing on the oil-stained concrete floor, a group of children. 7 of them. The youngest looked 9, the oldest maybe 13, all wearing the same institutional gray clothing, all silent, all standing in a loose cluster with their hands at their sides and their eyes fixed on the concrete floor. None of them were crying. That was the detail that hit Ryder hardest. None of them were crying because crying was something that had been trained out of them, or beaten out of them, or simply abandoned as a strategy that had never produced results. 3 men guarded the group, 2 in plain clothes with holstered sidearms, 1 in a deputy's uniform with a tactical vest and a radio clipped to his shoulder, and standing near the open truck doors, clipboard in hand, his back to Ryder, Sheriff Tom Barrett. He was speaking into a phone. His voice carried across the bay in the flat administrative tone of a man conducting inventory. 7 total. 3 go north to the Toledo contact, 4 ride south toward Cincinnati. I want the trucks cleared out by 0400. Tell the drivers to take alternate routes. No interstates until they're across the county line. Barrett hung up and turned to the deputy. Where's the diversion coming from? East fence. Sounds like 1 shooter, maybe 2. How many came through the north gate? The deputy hesitated. We're not sure. Barrett's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The flatness of his gaze communicated more than anger ever could, the controlled lethality of a man who had maintained a criminal empire for decades by treating every complication as a logistical problem to be solved. Find them, Barrett said, and put them down. The deputy spoke into his radio and moved toward the north corridor, directly toward Ryder and Eli. Ryder pulled back behind the shelving unit. He looked at Eli. The boy's good eye was locked on the cluster of children in the loading bay. He was scanning every face. Then his body went rigid. "Lucy," he breathed. Second from the left. A small girl with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing a gray sweatshirt 3 sizes too large, her hands clasped in front of her body. Her face was angled down, but even in profile, the resemblance to Eli was unmistakable. The same sharp jaw, the same dark eyes, the same quality of stillness that came from learning to occupy as little space as possible. Eli moved forward. Ryder grabbed his arm. "Wait," Ryder hissed. "That's her." "I see her. Wait." The deputy was 30 feet away, flashlight sweeping the corridor. Behind him, Barrett had turned back to the trucks, directing the loading process. The 2 plainclothes guards stood on either side of the children like bookends. Ryder had 4 shells in Danny's shotgun, 1 deputy approaching, 2 guards in the bay. Barrett, 4 targets, 4 shells. He was not a killer. He had spent 15 years of his life in proximity to violence, and he had committed acts that still visited him at 3 a.m. when the garage was silent, and the memories pressed against his skull like water behind a dam. But he had never killed anyone. That line existed inside him like a structural beam. Remove it, and everything above would collapse. But he was also not going to watch 7 children get loaded into trucks and driven into oblivion. The deputy's flashlight beam swept within 6 feet of the shelving unit. Ryder pressed himself flat against the metal. Eli pressed behind him. The light passed. Then Mara's shotgun spoke again from outside. 2 rapid blasts, and the depot's remaining east side floodlights died in a cascade of sparking glass. The loading bay plunged into half-darkness. Barrett's head snapped toward the east wall. "What the hell is happening out there?" The deputy turned back toward the east exit, radio crackling. "Multiple shooters, east perimeter." Ryder moved. He came around the shelving unit fast, shotgun leveled, and closed the distance to the deputy in 4 strides. He didn't fire. He reversed the shotgun and drove the stock into the base of the deputy's skull with a controlled, precise strike that dropped the man to the concrete like a marionette with cut strings. The flashlight clattered. The radio squawked. One of the plainclothes guards turned. His hand went to his holster. Ryder racked the shotgun. The sound, that unmistakable mechanical declaration, froze the room. "Don't," Ryder said. The guard's hand stopped on the holster. The second guard stepped backward, his eyes calculating distances and odds. He was younger, faster, and he was looking at the shotgun like a man measuring the gap between where he stood and where the barrel pointed. Barrett turned around slowly, the clipboard lowered to his side. His face registered the intruder, Varpas. Processed, categorized, filed. Recognition flickered across his features like a fluorescent light warming up. "Ryder Vale," Barrett said. He said it the way you'd say the name of a tool you'd misplaced and found again. Mildly annoyed, slightly amused. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Step away from the children." Barrett didn't move. He tilted his head slightly, studying Ryder with the patient, clinical interest of a man who'd dealt with complications before and always found them temporary. "You look like your brother," Barrett said. "Same stance, same jaw, same stupid idea that one man with a gun can change anything." The words hit Ryder like a physical blow. "Danny stood right about where you're standing," Barrett continued, his voice conversational. 3 years ago, different night, same situation. He had a phone full of photographs and a head full of righteous fury, and he thought that was enough." Ryder's finger found the trigger. "He came here alone," Barrett said. "Middle of the night, just like you. Thought he could document everything and walk out. Thought the system would protect him if he had enough evidence." "Shut up." "I gave him a chance. I told him to delete the photographs and go home. Told him nobody would believe a mechanic over a 30-year sheriff. Told him the smart play was silence. I said shut up." Barrett's eyes were steady, patient. The eyes of a predator who'd learned that stillness was more effective than speed. "Your brother chose the hard way, Ryder. He chose to be brave. And I personally put the needle in his arm in room 114 of the Route 41 Motor Lodge. and held him down while his heart stopped beating. The world inverted. Every sound in the depot, the idling trucks, the crackling radios, the distant echo of Mara's shotgun, collapsed into a single high-pitched frequency that filled Ryder's skull like a drill. 7 years. 7 years of grief, of guilt, of standing in the garage at 3 a.m. staring at Danny's workbench and asking himself what he'd missed, what he could have done, how he'd failed to see his brother drowning. 7 years of believing Danny had fallen into drugs, believing the official story, the coroner's report, the sheriff's sympathetic handshake at the funeral. Barrett's handshake. Barrett had attended the funeral. He'd stood in the cemetery in his dress uniform and shaken Ryder's hand and said, "I'm sorry for your loss," with the practiced sincerity of a man who'd written the eulogy for his own crime. "You were at the funeral," Ryder whispered. "I sent flowers, too." The shotgun trembled in Ryder's hands. He wanted to fire. Every fiber of muscle, every synapse of nerve, every molecule of blood in his body screamed at him to squeeze the trigger and turn Barrett's chest into a crater. But the children were standing 10 feet behind Barrett. 7 children in gray clothing who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even flinched at the violence erupting around them. Because violence was the weather system they'd lived inside for months, and flinching was a luxury that changed nothing. If he fired, the spread could reach them. If he fired, he was a killer. If he fired, he was exactly what Barrett had told the world he was. "Eli," Ryder said without turning around. The boy stepped out from behind the shelving unit. Barrett saw him. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. The first genuine emotion Ryder had seen on his face. Not fear. Annoyance. The irritation of a man who'd misplaced a piece of inventory and found it in the wrong hands. "The runner," Barrett said. "You should have kept running, son." "I'm not your son," Eli said. Lucy's head came up. The small girl in the gray sweatshirt lifted her face from the concrete floor and saw her brother standing in the half-light of a freight depot, bruised, broken, one eye swollen shut, and alive. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. "Lucy," Eli said. His voice broke. "I came back." The girl trembled. Her hands unclenched at her sides. Her eyes filled with something that the last 4 months had nearly extinguished. Recognition. The recognition that someone in the world still knew her name and had come to say it out loud. She took 1 step forward. The younger guard grabbed her arm. "Don't move," the guard said. Ryder shifted the shotgun toward the guard. "Let her go. You shoot me, the other one drops the kid behind you," the guard said. "Math doesn't work for you, old man." He was right. The second guard had drawn his weapon and was aiming at Eli. A triangle of violence. Ryder's shotgun on guard 1, guard 2's pistol on Eli, and Barrett standing in the center with no weapon drawn and no expression on his face. A standoff. Then Diesel Madden drove his flatbed tow truck through the north wall of the depot. The impact was seismic. Corrugated steel panels exploded inward. A support beam buckled and dropped a section of the roof. Concrete dust erupted in a choking cloud that turned the floodlights into white pillars of nothing. The sound, metal screaming against metal, engine roaring, structure collapsing, was so enormous it registered not as noise, but as a physical force that knocked guard 2 off his feet and sent his pistol skidding across the concrete floor. Diesel's truck plowed through the wall and came to rest at a 45-degree angle across the loading bay, its chrome push bar buried in a collapsed shelving unit, its engine still running, its headlights blazing through the dust like the eyes of something ancient and merciless. The truck door opened. Diesel stepped down. He held a 4-foot length of industrial chain in his right hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Guard 1 released Lucy's arm and stepped backward, reaching for his weapon. Diesel crossed the distance in 3 strides, impossibly fast for a man his size, and swung the chain in a flat arc that caught the guard across the forearm. The snap of breaking bone was audible above the settling debris. The guard screamed and dropped to his knees. Ryder moved to Eli. "Get Lucy. Get the others. Move them to the truck." Eli was already running. He reached Lucy and dropped to his knees in front of her. The girl stared at him, at his swollen face, his torn clothing, the blood dried in his hair, and her lips moved without sound. "It's me," Eli said. It's really me. We're going home. Lucy's hand reached out and touched his face. Her fingers traced the bruises around his ruined eye with a delicacy that belonged to a different world. A world where people touched each other gently, where damage was something you assessed with tenderness rather than fear. Then she collapsed against his chest, and her body shook with sobs so deep they seemed to originate from somewhere below her bones. Eli wrapped his arms around her and held on. Behind them, Barrett was moving. Ryder turned in time to see the sheriff reach the open cab of the semi-truck. Barrett pulled himself up into the driver's seat with the agility of a man who'd spent his life outrunning consequences. The diesel engine roared to full throttle. The semi lurched forward, its trailer swinging wide across the loading bay, its massive frame destroying everything in its path: pallets, crates, shelving units. As Barrett aimed the vehicle toward the depot's main exit gate, Mara appeared through the east side breach she'd created, shotgun raised. She fired once at the semi's tires. Missed. The truck was accelerating, its trailer fishtailing across the wet concrete, heading for the gate and the open road beyond. If Barrett reached the highway, he'd disappear. He had resources, contacts, a network built over 3 decades of systemic corruption. He would vanish into the same infrastructure that had swallowed children for years, and no evidence on any disposable camera would ever be enough to pull him back. Ryder sprinted for his motorcycle. The Sportster sat where he'd left it outside the north gate, keys in the ignition. He threw his leg over the seat, hit the starter, felt the engine catch and roar beneath him. He shot through the gate and onto County Road 9 as the semi's taillights disappeared around the first curve. Rain had started again. Light at first, then heavier, turning the road surface into a black mirror that reflected his headlight back at him in fragmented streaks. The semi was fast, faster than a loaded trailer should have been, and Barrett was driving with the reckless precision of a man who understood that this road was the last stretch of highway between him and the rest of his life. Ryder pushed the Sportster to 90. The engine screamed beneath him, wind tore at his jacket, rain hammered his face like needles. The road curved and dipped through farmland and dead industrial lots, the semi's taillights appearing and disappearing around bends like the pulse of a dying heartbeat. Behind him, fading into the distance, the depot was in chaos. Children were being loaded into Vic's truck. Mara was providing cover. Diesel stood in the wreckage like a monument to controlled destruction. But Ryder wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about room 114 of the Route 41 Motor Lodge. He was thinking about his brother on a stainless steel table. He was thinking about Barrett's hand on his shoulder at the funeral, the practiced weight of it, the obscene intimacy of a murderer comforting the brother of his victim. And he was thinking about the shotgun strapped to his back, and how easy it would be to end this with 4 ounces of trigger pressure. The semi's brake lights flared ahead. Barrett was turning, hard right onto Route 41, heading south toward the interstate. The trailer swung wide, its rear wheels leaving the pavement, throwing gravel and mud in a rooster tail that Ryder drove straight through. He gained ground on the straight stretch of 41. The Sportster ate the distance between them with predatory efficiency. 50 yards, 30, 20. He could see Barrett's face in the truck's side mirror now, illuminated by dashboard light, jaw set, eyes fixed forward, the face of a man running calculations even in flight. Then the semi's rear doors swung open. One of Barrett's men, hidden inside the trailer, appeared in the opening with a rifle. The muzzle flash was a white star in the rain. Ryder swerved. The bullet passed close enough that he felt the pressure change against his left ear. He dropped the bike low, almost horizontal, his knee nearly touching the wet asphalt, and accelerated under the trailer's blind spot. A second shot cracked the pavement where he'd been a half-second earlier. He pulled alongside the trailer, riding in the narrow gap between the semi and the drainage ditch, and reached back for Danny's shotgun with one hand while steering with the other. The riflemen in the trailer doors tried to track him, but couldn't angle down far enough. A third shot punched through the Sportster's saddlebag, 6 inches from Ryder's leg. Ryder raised the shotgun one-handed and fired upward into the trailer door's hinge mechanism. The blast tore the right door free. It swung outward on its remaining hinge and slammed into the road surface, sending up a shower of sparks that illuminated the rain like fireworks. The rifleman lost his footing and tumbled backward into the empty trailer. Ryder accelerated past the trailer and pulled alongside the cab. Through the passenger window, he could see Barrett. The sheriff turned his head and looked directly at Ryder. For one frozen moment, a single heartbeat stretched across the rain and the road and the roaring engines. The two men locked eyes. Barrett's expression was unreadable. Then the sheriff jerked the steering wheel left. The semi swerved into Ryder's lane. The massive cab closed the gap between truck and ditch with lethal geometry. Ryder had less than a second to react. He braked hard, the Sportster's rear tire breaking loose on the wet surface, and the semi's bumper passed within inches of his front wheel. The bike went sideways. Ryder hit the pavement at 60 miles per hour and slid across the wet asphalt in a shower of sparks and pain, the motorcycle tumbling away from him in a cartwheel of chrome and steel. His jacket absorbed the worst of it, but his left arm took the road surface direct. Skin, then muscle, then the searing white heat of exposed nerve. He came to rest in the drainage ditch. Rain filled his eyes. His left arm was on fire. The Sportster lay 20 yards ahead, its front wheel still spinning, its headlight casting a dying beam across the road. The semi's brake lights flared in the distance. Then, impossibly, the truck began to slow down. Barrett was coming back. Ryder rolled onto his stomach and pushed himself to his knees with his good arm. His left arm hung at his side, the jacket sleeve torn away, the skin beneath a raw, weeping landscape of road rash that ran from wrist to shoulder. He looked for the shotgun. It had landed 6 feet away, in the mud at the edge of the ditch. He crawled to it, picked it up. Checked the action. Mud in the mechanism, but it cycled. 2 shells left. The semi was reversing now, its backup lights painting the rain white. Barrett guiding the massive truck backward down Route 41 with the patience of a man finishing a job. Ryder stood. He planted his boots in the mud and the rain and raised Danny's shotgun with one working arm, the barrel wavering, his vision blurred, blood running from a gash above his right eye. The semi stopped 30 yards away. The driver's door opened. Barrett stepped down onto the wet pavement. He was holding a revolver. "Your brother made the same face," Barrett said, walking toward him through the rain. Right before the end, the same stubborn, stupid, heroic face, like dying for something makes it worth dying for. Ryder held the shotgun steady, or as steady as one arm and blood loss allowed. "You want to know the worst part, Ryder? Danny could have walked away. He could have deleted those photos and gone back to his garage and lived his life. But he had the same disease you have, the same thing that kid has. He couldn't leave it alone. He had to be the one who stood up." Barrett raised the revolver. "Nobody stands up, not in this town, not anywhere." The click of the revolver's hammer pulling back was the loudest sound Ryder had ever heard. Then headlights exploded from the south. A vehicle, moving fast, engine screaming, tore up Route 41 and slammed its brakes 30 feet from Barrett. The driver's door flew open and Vic Reno stepped out, his face white, his hands shaking, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "Barrett!" The sheriff turned. "It's over," Vic said. "Mara just uploaded every photograph from that camera to 6 different servers, news outlets, federal databases, an encrypted whistleblower network in 3 states. It's done. You can kill him. You can kill all of us. It doesn't matter anymore. The evidence is everywhere." Barrett stood in the rain between Ryder and Vic, the revolver at his side, and for the first time since Ryder had known of him, the sheriff's mask cracked. Not fear, not rage. Something worse. The exhausted recognition of a man who'd spent 30 years building something and had just watched the foundation dissolve beneath his feet. He looked at Ryder. He looked at Vic. He looked at the revolver in his hand. Then he raised the weapon again and pointed it directly at Ryder's chest. "Then I'll take the satisfaction." A shotgun blast split the night. Not from Ryder's gun. From behind Barrett. Mara Quinn stood in the road, 50 yards south, the Mossberg smoking in her hands. She'd fired into the asphalt 3 feet from Barrett's boots. Close enough to shower him with gravel fragments. Close enough to make the point. "Next one isn't a warning," she called through the rain. Barrett looked at the ground where the shot had landed. Then at Mara. Then at Ryder. He was surrounded. The revolver trembled in his hand. Rain ran down his face. His uniform was soaked, the badge on his chest catching the headlight glare in sporadic silver flashes. In the distance, the first wail of a siren cut through the storm. Real law enforcement this time, summoned by the digital wildfire that Mara and Vic had ignited across every channel they could reach. Barrett heard it too. His shoulders dropped. Not in surrender, in the mechanical failure of a man whose operating system had finally crashed. He lowered the revolver. And Ryder Vale stood in the rain on Route 41 with his dead brother's shotgun in his one working hand, blood streaming down his face, and watched the man who had murdered Danny Vale 7 years ago finally stop running. But the sirens were still far away. And in Barrett's eyes, something was rearranging. The cold administrative logic reassembling itself behind the cracked mask, the survival instinct of a man who had stayed free for 30 years recalculating its options. He still had the revolver, and Ryder had 2 shells and 1 arm and a town full of people who still believed their sheriff was a hero. The rain hammered the road between them like a countdown neither of them could stop. Barrett moved first, not toward Ryder, not toward Mara. He pivoted on his heel and threw himself back into the semi's cab with a speed that betrayed 30 years of calculated survival. The reflexes of a man who'd never once been caught because he always had one more exit planned than everyone else in the room. The diesel engine screamed. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on wet asphalt, the trailer fishtailing wildly as Barrett floored the accelerator and aimed the rig south toward the interstate on-ramp 3 miles down Route 41. Mara fired. The Mossberg's last shell tore through the semi's passenger side mirror and shattered the window. Glass sprayed into the cab. Barrett didn't slow down. The truck plowed through the rain, its taillight shrinking into red smears against the darkness. "He's running," Vic said. Ryder was already moving. His left arm hung useless at his side. Road rash from wrist to shoulder, the skin split and weeping through the shredded remains of his jacket sleeve. His vision pulsed with each heartbeat. Blood from the gash above his eye had crusted into a thick line that bisected his face like a war paint stripe he hadn't chosen. He staggered to the Sportster. The motorcycle lay on its side in the drainage ditch. The left mirror snapped off, the tank dented, the exhaust pipe scraped down to bare metal. But the frame was intact. The engine was intact. The wheels were straight. Ryder gripped the handlebar with his right hand and pulled. The bike didn't move. 250 pounds of iron and steel and his one working arm couldn't generate the leverage. Vic appeared beside him. Together they hauled the Sportster upright. Ryder threw his leg over the seat and hit the starter. The engine coughed, turned over, coughed again. "Come on," Ryder whispered. The starter whined. The engine caught on the 3rd try. Rough, uneven, a sick sound that any mechanic would recognize as damage, but running, still running. "Ryder!" Mara's voice came from behind him. She'd crossed the distance from her firing position and stood at the edge of the ditch, the empty Mossberg hanging at her side. "The kids are secure. Vic's truck, south of the depot. Diesel's with them. But Barrett, if he reaches the interstate, he's got contacts in 4 states who'll disappear him before the feds can mobilize." "I know. Your arm is destroyed. You can barely see. That bike sounds like it's dying." "I know, Mara." She stared at him. Rain ran down her face, plastering her silver-streaked hair against her skull. Her eyes held the expression he'd seen once before, in a field hospital in Kandahar, in a photograph she'd shown him years ago during a late-night conversation neither of them ever mentioned again. The expression of a medic watching someone choose the wound over the treatment. "Don't die on that road," she said. "I'm not burying another Vale." Ryder didn't answer. He twisted the throttle with his right hand, felt the engine surge beneath him, sick but willing, damaged but not finished, and tore on to Route 41 heading south. The rain was heavier now, the kind that turned headlights into useless cones of white noise and reduced the road to a series of guesses between asphalt and oblivion. Ryder rode one-handed, his left arm pressed against his body. The pain a constant electrical fire that radiated from his wrist through his shoulder and into the base of his skull. He could see the semi ahead, a quarter mile. Its trailer was still fishtailing on the wet road, Barrett driving aggressively, pushing the rig beyond its safe handling parameters. The detached right door flapped on its remaining hinge, creating a rhythmic metallic bang that Ryder could hear even above his own engine. He closed the gap. 200 yards, 150. 100. At 75 yards, he could see into the open rear of the trailer through the missing door. Empty. The rifleman who'd fired at him earlier was gone, thrown clear when the door blew off. or fled into the darkness. The trailer was a hollow steel box now, its interior lit by a single emergency bulb that swung on its wire with each swerve of the truck. Barrett swerved again. A hard left that took the semi across the center line and back, testing Ryder's position, trying to force him into the oncoming lane where a head-on collision with any vehicle would be fatal at these speeds. Ryder held his line. 60 yards. 50. The interstate on-ramp appeared ahead, a sweeping right-hand curve that rose above the surrounding farmland on a concrete overpass. Once Barrett made that ramp, he'd merge into anonymous southbound traffic and vanish. Ryder had maybe 90 seconds. He pushed the Sportster to its limit. The engine screamed, a sound that was half power and half damage, the mechanical equivalent of a man running on a broken leg. The speedometer needle touched 105. The bike vibrated with a frequency that traveled up through the handlebars and into Ryder's bones. He pulled alongside the trailer again. The open rear door was 3 feet from his right shoulder, the interior of the trailer a rushing dark rectangle. The semi's cab was 15 feet ahead, 15 feet of steel and rain, and Barrett's 30 years of getting away with murder. Ryder did the math. 1 arm, 1 motorcycle, 1 chance. The on-ramp was 800 yards ahead. He accelerated past the trailer and drew even with the cab's passenger side. Through the shattered window, he could see Barrett's profile, jaw clenched, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, eyes fixed forward with the tunnel vision intensity of a man in full flight. Barrett glanced right, saw Ryder. His expression didn't change. He jerked the wheel. The semi's cab swung right, closing the gap between truck and guardrail. Ryder had nowhere to go. Guardrail on his right, 18 wheels on his left. The gap narrowed from 6 feet to 4 to 2. Ryder braked. The Sportster's rear tire locked on the wet surface and the bike slewed sideways. He caught it. Barely. With a counter steer that required every ounce of riding skill he'd accumulated over 3 decades. The semi's cab swept past him, close enough that the wind displacement nearly pulled him under the trailer wheels. He fell back behind the truck. 700 yards to the on-ramp. Think. Think. The trailer's open rear door banged in its rhythm. The interior emergency light swung. The trailer floor was flat steel, slick with rain blowing in through the open end. Ryder looked at the trailer floor, then at the ramp mechanism at the rear, the metal loading ramp that folded up against the floor when the doors were closed but now hung partially deployed, its edge dragging sparks across the asphalt. A ramp. An insane idea formed in his mind with the clarity that only exhaustion and desperation could produce. He accelerated. The Sportster closed on the trailer's open rear, 30 feet, 20, 10. The loading ramp was angled at roughly 20 degrees, steep but rideable. The gap between the ramp's edge and the road surface was maybe 8 inches, bouncing with each bump in the pavement. 500 yards to the on-ramp. Ryder positioned the Sportster directly behind the trailer, matching its speed precisely. The ramp loomed ahead of him like a steel tongue extended from the truck's open mouth. Sparks flew where metal dragged on asphalt. He thought about Danny. He thought about Eli saying, "Don't become him." He thought about a 12-year-old girl touching her brother's bruised face with fingers that still remembered gentleness. He hit the ramp at 60 miles per hour. The Sportster's front wheel caught the steel edge, and the bike launched upward. For one impossible second, Ryder was airborne inside the trailer. Motorcycle and Ryder suspended in the emergency light's amber glow. And then the wheels slammed onto the trailer floor with a bone-jarring impact that nearly threw him over the handlebars. He was inside the trailer. The motorcycle skidded on the wet steel floor. Ryder planted his right boot and muscled the bike to a stop, the rear tire spinning against the slick surface. The trailer swayed around him. The emergency light swung overhead. Rain blasted in through the open rear door. He was 15 feet from the cab's rear wall. The wall was thin, a partition between the cargo area and the cab, standard commercial construction, plywood and sheet metal. Not armor. Not reinforced. 300 yards to the on-ramp. Ryder revved the Sportster. The engine howled inside the enclosed trailer, the sound amplified to a deafening roar that filled the steel box like the voice of every ghost he'd carried for 7 years. He released the brake. The motorcycle lunged forward across the trailer floor, 15 feet of acceleration. Not enough for real speed, but enough for mass times velocity to matter. He hit the partition at 40 miles per hour. The plywood exploded, sheet metal buckled and tore. Ryder burst through the cab's rear wall in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal, the Sportster's front wheel slamming onto the cab's floor between the driver and passenger seats. Barrett's face, for one fraction of a second, registered pure, undiluted shock. The first honest expression Ryder had ever seen on him. Ryder grabbed Barrett's shoulder with his right hand and pulled. The Sportster wedged against the dashboard. The cab filled with debris, dust, the smell of burning rubber. Barrett fought, his left hand releasing the steering wheel, his right swinging the revolver toward Ryder's face. The truck had no driver. 200 yards to the on-ramp, the semi began to drift. Without Barrett's hands on the wheel, the massive vehicle obeyed only physics, momentum, friction, gravity. It drifted left, crossed the center line, and began a slow, inevitable rotation toward the bridge overpass that carried Route 41 across the Coldwater River. Ryder slammed his forehead into Barrett's nose. Cartilage crunched. Blood sprayed across the dashboard. The revolver fired. The bullet punching through the roof of the cab, leaving a neat hole that instantly admitted a stream of rain. Barrett's grip on the weapon loosened. Ryder twisted it free with his one working hand and threw it behind him, into the wreckage of the partition. The truck hit the bridge guardrail at 55 miles per hour. Metal screamed. The cab crumpled on the passenger side as the guardrail tore through the door panel like a can opener through tin. The trailer jackknifed, the coupling point between cab and trailer folding at an angle that physics textbooks would describe as catastrophic. The entire rig slid sideways across the bridge, the trailer swinging wide and slamming into the opposite guardrail with a concussive impact that shattered the remaining emergency light and plunged the interior into darkness. The cab came to rest halfway over the bridge's edge. Silence. Not true silence. The engine was still running, a sick diesel clatter. Rain hammered the exposed cab roof. Somewhere in the wreckage, metal groaned and shifted. The bridge's guardrail creaked under the weight of the cab hanging over the river 40 feet below. Ryder opened his eyes. He was pressed against the dashboard, the Sportster's handlebars pinning his midsection. His left arm was beyond pain now. It existed in some territory past sensation, a dead weight attached to his shoulder. Blood covered his face. Blood covered everything. Barrett was slumped against the driver's door, which hung open over the void. The door's hinges had bent but held, creating a precarious platform between Barrett and the 40-foot drop to the river. Blood ran from his shattered nose. His uniform was torn. His badge hung from a single pin. The cab tilted. A slow, grinding shift of weight as gravity tested the guardrail's remaining capacity. The river was visible below, black, fast-moving, lit by the truck's one surviving headlight that pointed downward into the water like a searchlight hunting for something lost. Barrett moved. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself upright against the driver's door. His hand reached down to the floorboard and came up with a backup weapon, a compact pistol that had been holstered under the seat. Department issue, loaded. He pointed it at Ryder. "We both die here," Barrett said. His voice was thick with blood, his broken nose making each word sound like it was being pushed through a filter. "That works for me. I'm 63 years old. I've lived enough." The cab groaned, tilted another 2 degrees. The guardrail's mounting bolts began to pull free from the concrete one by one, with small metallic pings that sounded almost musical. "But you," Barrett continued, "you're 47. You've got maybe 30 years left. You want to spend them at the bottom of the Coldwater River because of something that happened to a boy who's been dead for 7 years? His name was Danny. His name doesn't matter. Names never mattered in this. Only systems matter. Supply lines, infrastructure, money. I didn't build this because I'm evil, Ryder. I built this because this town was dying, because the factories closed and the jobs left and the tax base collapsed and nobody in Columbus or Washington gave a damn whether Coldwater lived or died. So you sold children." Barrett's expression flickered. Something that might have been shame in a man who still possessed the capacity for it, which Barrett clearly did not. "I moved product through a dying corridor to keep the economy flowing. What that product was, that was someone else's decision, someone above me. I was infrastructure." You're a monster. I'm a civil servant who kept the lights on. The cab lurched. The guardrail screamed. One of the mounting brackets tore completely free, and the cab dropped 6 inches. Both men grabbed for anything solid. Ryder catching the dashboard, Barrett bracing against the seat frame. The pistol stayed aimed at Ryder's chest. Below them, the Coldwater River churned in the rain, its surface broken into whitecaps by the storm, the water level higher than usual from 3 days of continuous downpour. "Here's what happens," Barrett said. "You let me climb out of this cab. I walk south. I disappear. You never hear from me again. The operation is over. You've seen to that. The evidence is out. I'm finished in Mercer County, but I don't need Mercer County. I need a beach in a country with no extradition treaty and a bank account that's been accumulating for 30 years. And the children? The children are free. Thanks to you. Congratulations." "And Danny?" Barrett stared at him. "Danny is dead, Ryder. Killing me doesn't bring him back. Dying with me doesn't bring him back." The cab groaned. The remaining guardrail bolts strained. Barrett was right about one thing. If this cab went into the river, they both died. The cab would sink in seconds. The water was freezing, fast, deep. With one working arm and blood loss, Ryder would last minutes at most. But Barrett was wrong about everything else. "You don't get to walk away," Ryder said. "Then we both die." "Maybe." Barrett studied him with the appraising look of a man who'd spent his career reading people and deciding their fates. Something in Ryder's face told him what he needed to know. "You're not bluffing," Barrett said. "No. You'd actually die on this bridge to stop me." "I'd die on this bridge because my brother died on Route 41 and nobody stopped you then. Someone stops you now, even if stopping you costs everything." The cab shifted again. The tilt was approaching critical. The angle where gravity would overpower friction and the entire structure would slide off the bridge into the river below. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. Barrett's gun hand trembled, not from fear, from the cold calculus of a man whose exit strategy had just been invalidated. Then a sound from behind them. Inside the wrecked trailer, movement, footsteps on steel, someone climbing through the partition wreckage. Eli appeared in the shattered wall between the trailer and the cab. His face was a mask of bruises and exhaustion. His fractured ribs made every breath a visible effort. His hands gripped the torn edges of the partition, his body framed in the jagged opening like a figure standing in a wound. He'd followed them. Somehow, on foot, hitching a ride, commandeering Vic's truck, some impossible act of 15-year-old determination, he'd followed them to the bridge. Barrett turned the gun toward Eli. "Don't," Ryder said. "The boy is a witness, the only one who saw my face at the depot. Your photographs are noise. Lawyers can argue chain of custody, digital manipulation, 100 challenges. But an eyewitness who escaped my operation and identified me personally, that's a conviction. There are 7 children who can identify you. Children who were transported blindfolded and drugged. Their testimony is compromised by definition. This one," he gestured at Eli with the pistol, "this one stole a camera, shot photographs, escaped custody, and found the one man in this county with a personal vendetta against me. This one is the case." Eli didn't move. He stood in the partition opening, looking at Barrett, looking at the gun, looking at the 40-foot drop beneath the cab. Then he looked at Ryder. "Are you okay?" Eli asked. The question was so simple, so absurd, so completely out of proportion to the moment that Ryder almost laughed. Almost. But what came instead was something harder and older, a sound that might have been a sob if he'd allowed it oxygen, pressed back down into his chest by sheer force of will. "I'm okay, kid. You don't look okay." "I'm okay." Eli looked at Barrett again, at the gun, at the bridge crumbling beneath them, and he did something that no one in the cab expected, least of all Ryder. He stepped forward, through the partition, into the tilting cab, one step, then another, until he stood between Barrett's gun and Ryder's body. "Move," Barrett said. Eli didn't move. "I will shoot through you to reach him." "No, you won't." "You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know exactly what you're capable of." Eli's voice was steady, quiet. The voice of someone who had been inside Barrett's operation, who had been bound and transported and beaten and cataloged as inventory, who had counted 72-hour cycles in the dark and stolen a camera and jumped from a moving van and walked 40 miles through rain to stand in this exact moment. I've seen everything you're capable of, and you've never once pulled the trigger yourself. You hire people, you organize, you administrate. You had someone else hold Danny Vale down while you put the needle in, because you can't do the hard part alone. You never could. Barrett's face changed. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Beneath it was something Ryder hadn't expected. Not rage, not cruelty, exhaustion. The bone-deep, soul-level exhaustion of a man who'd been performing for 30 years without intermission. "You're 15 years old," Barrett said. "You don't know anything about anything. I know you're not going to shoot me. And why is that? Because if you were going to, you'd have done it at the depot. When you had me cornered, when nobody was watching, you didn't. You tried to run instead. Because killing a kid yourself, with your own hand looking at their face, that's the one thing you can't do. It's the one line you've never crossed, because crossing it would make you something even you can't live with." The cab groaned. Another bolt sheared. The tilt increased. Rain poured through every crack and opening, turning the interior into a waterfall. Barrett looked at this boy standing in front of him. 15 years old, broken, unarmed, telling a 63-year-old man with a gun exactly who he was. Not who the town thought he was, not who the badge said he was, but who he actually was underneath the 30 years of performance. The pistol lowered, 1 inch, 2. Barrett's hand dropped to his side, and Ryder, with his one working arm, lunged forward, grabbed the pistol from Barrett's loosened grip, and threw it through the open driver's door into the river below. It disappeared without a sound. Barrett slumped against the doorframe. The fight had left his body. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but the way air leaves a tire, slowly and visibly until the structure can no longer support its own weight. Sirens. Close now. Not the distant wail from before, but the immediate, present scream of multiple vehicles converging on the bridge from both directions. Red and blue lights painted the rain from the north. More lights from the south. State police cruisers, federal vehicles. The response summoned by Mara's digital assault on every channel available. "Eli," Ryder said, "get out of the cab." "Not without you. The bridge is failing. This cab is going over in less than a minute. Get out." "Not without you." The stubbornness in the boy's voice was absolute. The same stubbornness that had carried him 40 miles through rain, that had made him steal a camera in the dark, that had put him between a gun and the only adult who'd ever chosen him. Ryder pushed himself free from the motorcycle wreckage, pinning his midsection. Pain detonated across his body. Ribs, arm, face, every joint and muscle screaming in unified protest. He grabbed Eli's shoulder with his right hand and shoved the boy toward the partition opening. "Climb! Now!" Eli climbed. Through the partition, into the trailer, toward the open rear where the rain and the road and the world outside waited. Ryder followed. One-armed, bleeding, dragging himself through the wreckage with the same stubborn refusal to die that had apparently been genetic in the Vale family. His fingers found the partition's torn edge. He pulled. His boots found purchase on the cab's tilting floor. He pushed. Behind him, Barrett hadn't moved. The sheriff sat in the driver's seat of a cab, hanging over a river, his hands empty, his badge hanging by a single pin, watching the man he'd tried to kill climb to safety with the same quiet, administrative expression he'd worn his entire career. "Barrett," Ryder said from the partition opening. "Climb." Barrett looked at him. "Climb, you son of a bitch." For a moment, one breath, one heartbeat, something human passed through Tom Barrett's eyes. Not remorse, not redemption, just the ancient animal recognition that dying alone in a river was worse than facing what waited on the other side of the bridge. He climbed. They made it through the trailer and out the open rear door 30 seconds before the guardrail's final bolt surrendered. The cab tore free and dropped, slowly at first, then with the sudden acceleration of mass obeying gravity, and hit the Coldwater River with an impact that sent a geyser of black water 40 feet into the air. The Sportster went with it. Ryder watched his motorcycle, his dead brother's rebuilt motorcycle, the machine he'd poured 7 years of grief into maintaining, sink into the river and vanish beneath the current. He stood in the rain on the bridge, one arm hanging dead, blood covering every inch of him, and watched the last physical piece of Danny Vale disappear into water so dark it looked like it had never reflected light. Eli stood beside him. The boy reached out and took Ryder's good hand. Not dramatically, not symbolically, just the way a child takes an adult's hand when neither of them can stand alone anymore. They stood like that as the police cruisers reached the bridge. Doors opened. Officers emerged into the rain. Commands were shouted. Flashlight beams swept across the wreckage. The jackknife trailer, the destroyed guardrail, the two figures standing hand in hand at the edge of a gap in the bridge that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. And behind them, sitting on the wet asphalt of Route 41, with his hands resting on his knees and his badge finally fallen from his chest, Tom Barrett waited. State troopers approached with weapons drawn. Federal agents in tactical gear materialized from vehicles that bore no county markings. A helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight turning the rain into a curtain of liquid silver. Barrett raised his hands, slowly, precisely. The way a man surrenders when surrender is a logistical decision rather than an emotional one. He was handcuffed on the bridge in the rain, read his rights by a federal agent who spoke in a monotone that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment on the drive up, and led to a black SUV that had no sheriff's department markings on it. As he passed Ryder, Barrett stopped. The agents flanking him tensed. Barrett looked at Ryder with an expression that had been stripped of every performance, every mask, every carefully constructed persona. He was brave, Barrett said. Your brother, for what it's worth. It's worth nothing, Ryder said. Barrett nodded, as if that was the only honest exchange they'd ever had. They put him in the SUV, the door closed, the vehicle pulled away. And Tom Barrett, 32-year sheriff of Mercer County, disappeared into the same rain-soaked darkness that had covered his crimes for 3 decades. Ryder's legs gave out. He went down on the bridge asphalt, slowly, controlled, the way a building collapses when the demolition charges fire in sequence. First his knees, then his hand, then his shoulder. Then he was lying on the wet road surface, staring up at the rain falling from a sky so black it seemed like the atmosphere itself had been bruised. Ryder! Eli's voice, distant, filtered through the ringing in his ears. Medic! Someone else, Mara? Shouting from somewhere far away, getting closer. Hands on him. The cold snap of nitrile gloves against his skin. Fingers on his neck, finding his pulse. Mara's face appearing above him, backlit by the helicopter's searchlight, rain streaming down her jaw. Stay with me, she said. Open your eyes. Stay with me, Ryder. He tried to speak. His mouth formed words, but no sound came. You stupid, stubborn, magnificent idiot, Mara said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the first time Ryder had ever heard Mara Quinn's voice break. You drove a motorcycle into a moving truck. Who does that? He wanted to tell her it had seemed logical at the time. He wanted to tell her that Danny would have laughed. He wanted to tell her that somewhere at the bottom of the Coldwater River, the Sportster was finally at rest, and maybe that was where it had always been headed. But instead, his vision narrowed. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Eli's face above his own, bruised, swollen, 15 years old, and the boy was saying something that Ryder couldn't hear over the rain and the sirens and the helicopter and the sound of his own heartbeat finally, reluctantly, slowing down. But he could read the boy's lips. Stay. Just that one word. Stay. And somewhere in the space between consciousness and the dark, Ryder Vale decided that for the first time in 7 years, someone had given him a reason to listen. The first thing Ryder heard when he came back was the beeping. Steady. Mechanical. The antiseptic rhythm of a heart monitor translating his existence into a series of green peaks on a black screen. Each beep was a small argument against the darkness. Proof that the machinery inside his chest was still operational, still turning over, still refusing to quit despite every reason he'd given it. He opened his eyes. White ceiling. Fluorescent lights behind frosted panels. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something softer, clean cotton, maybe, or the particular sterility of hospital air that had been recycled through filters designed to remove everything human from it. His left arm was immobilized in a rigid splint and wrapped in layers of gauze that made it look like it belonged to someone twice his size. An IV line ran from his right hand to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a steel pole. His ribs were taped. The gash above his eye had been sutured, 7 stitches, he'd learn later, and covered with a butterfly bandage. He turned his head. Mara sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, her boots propped on the metal railing, a paper cup of hospital coffee balanced on her knee. She was reading a 2-day-old newspaper with the casual intensity of someone who'd been keeping vigil long enough to exhaust every other form of entertainment. "What day is it?" Ryder's voice came out as gravel scraped across concrete. Mara folded the newspaper. "Thursday. You've been out since Tuesday night. The kids. All 7 are in protective custody. Federal, not county. Eli made sure of that. He refused to let anyone wearing a Mercer County badge near them, threw a chair at a deputy who tried to enter the waiting room." A pause. The deputy backed off. "Lucy?" "With Eli. They haven't been separated since the depot." A social worker tried to take Lucy for a separate interview, and Eli physically blocked the doorway until they agreed to let him stay in the room. Mara's voice carried something Ryder hadn't heard in it before. Not admiration exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one stubborn survivor identifying another. "That kid's got more fight in him than most adults I've served with." Ryder closed his eyes. The beeping continued. The IV dripped. "Barrett? Federal detention. No bail. The photographs are in evidence, all 23 exposures." Vic's whistleblower contact distributed copies to 4 news outlets and 2 federal databases before Barrett's lawyers could even file for a restraining order. "It's everywhere, Ryder. National news, congressional inquiries. The FBI is dismantling the entire corridor. 3 states, 14 arrests so far, with more coming." She paused. "They found the motel records. Room 114, Route 41 Motor Lodge. The original guest log from the night Danny died. Barrett's name wasn't on it, but his department credit card was. For the room next door." Ryder's jaw tightened. "The coroner who ruled it an overdose has been arrested. 2 deputies who helped stage the scene are cooperating with prosecutors. They're going to reopen Danny's case officially." Mara set her coffee down and leaned forward. "Ryder, they're going to clear his name. The overdose ruling will be vacated. Danny's death will be reclassified as a homicide." The words entered Ryder's body like a slow-moving wave, not crashing, not violent, just a deep tidal pressure that rose through his chest and pressed against the backs of his eyes. 7 years. 7 years of people looking at him with the quiet pity reserved for families of addicts. 7 years of strangers in town who didn't say it to his face, but said it to each other. Danny Vale, the younger one, drugs. Such a shame, and Ryder just let it happen. 7 years of carrying a dead brother's reputation like a stone in his pocket, heavy enough to drown in, but not heavy enough to kill him outright. And now, in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and recycled air, someone was telling him the truth had finally surfaced. He didn't cry. The tears were there, but he could feel them, pressurized, waiting, but they belonged to a moment he wasn't ready for yet. Not here. Not with monitors and IV lines and the mechanical beeping reminding him that survival was a technical process before it was an emotional one. "Where's Diesel?" he asked. "Parking lot. He's been sleeping in the tow truck since Tuesday. Won't come inside, says hospitals make him nervous." Mara almost smiled. A man who drove a flatbed through a concrete wall is nervous about linoleum floors. "Vic?" Mara's expression shifted. Something more complicated moved through her features, the rearrangement of a judgment she'd been carrying since the moment Vic Reno had walked into the garage. "Vic's been with the FBI since Wednesday morning, voluntarily. He's giving them everything he knows about the corridor, every smuggling route, every contact, every piece of infrastructure he encountered during his time inside. He's cooperating fully." "They gonna charge him?" His lawyer says no. The FBI wants his testimony more than his conviction. He's a witness, not a defendant. She paused. "He saved your life on that road, Ryder. Whatever else he is, whatever he was. He drove back into a situation where an armed sheriff was pointing a gun at you. He didn't have to do that." "I know. I was wrong about him." The admission cost her something. Ryder could see it in the way her jaw set, the way her fingers tightened around the paper cup. Mara Quinn did not revise her assessments lightly. The fact that she was doing it aloud without prompting told Ryder everything he needed to know about what the last 48 hours had done to all of them. "You were right to question him," Ryder said. "That's what kept us alive. Being paranoid kept us alive. Being careful kept us alive. There's a difference." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, collected her coffee, and walked to the door. "Eli's in the waiting room. He's been there since they brought you in. Hasn't left. Hasn't slept. The nurses tried to get him into a bed twice, and he told them he'd sleep when you woke up." She opened the door. "I'll send him in." She left. Ryder lay in the bed and listened to the beeping and the distant sounds of a hospital conducting its daily business. Rolling carts, muffled voices, the soft alarm of another monitor somewhere down the hall. The fluorescent light above him buzzed at a frequency he recognized from the garage. The same brand of fixture, the same cheap ballast, the same persistent hum that had been the soundtrack of his life for 7 years. The door opened. Eli stood in the frame. He looked different. Not better. Not yet. But different. Someone had given him clean clothes, a gray sweatshirt too large for his frame, dark pants, white sneakers that still had the creases of being new. The swelling around his left eye had receded enough to allow it partially open, revealing a bloodshot iris that scanned the room with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd been trained by circumstance to assess every space for threats before entering it. His right hand held the hand of a small girl who stood partially behind him. Lucy. Ryder saw her for the first time in person, not through a chain-link fence, not in the ghostly reverse of a photographic negative, but here, real, standing in a hospital doorway in a purple sweatshirt with a cartoon she was too old for printed on the front. Dark hair pulled back in the same messy ponytail he'd seen at the depot. Eyes that matched her brother's. Dark, watchful, carrying a depth of experience that no 12-year-old's eyes should contain. She was holding Eli's hand the way a shipwreck survivor holds a piece of driftwood, not with hope, but with the understanding that letting go meant drowning. "Hey," Ryder said. Eli walked to the bedside. Lucy followed, her eyes fixed on Ryder with an intensity that was part evaluation and part something else. The cautious, preliminary calibration of a child deciding whether a new adult was safe. "You look terrible," Eli said. "You said that before." "It's still true." Ryder looked at Lucy. The girl hadn't spoken. She stood beside Eli with her shoulders slightly hunched, her free hand gripping the hem of her sweatshirt, her body angled so that Eli remained between her and the bed. "Lucy," Ryder said. "I'm Ryder." She didn't respond. Her eyes moved from his face to his bandaged arm, to the IV line, to the monitor, and back to his face, reading him the way you'd read a document in a language you were still learning. "He's the one," Eli said quietly to his sister. "The one I told you about. The garage." Lucy's grip on Eli's hand tightened. Her eyes stayed on Ryder. Then, very slowly, she nodded. One nod. That was all. But the weight of it, the cost of a 12-year-old girl deciding to acknowledge a stranger as something other than a threat, was greater than anything that had happened on the bridge. Ryder nodded back. "There's a chair," he said to Eli. "Sit down before you fall down." Eli sat. Lucy stood beside him, her hand still locked in his, her gaze now moving around the room with diminishing urgency, checking the corners, the window, the door, the monitor, and gradually, incrementally, finding nothing that required defensive action. "The FBI wants my testimony," Eli said. "Full deposition. Every detail of the operation, routes, faces, procedures, timeline. They want to do it next week. You okay with that?" "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice." "No." Eli's voice was quiet but absolute. "I don't. Because if I don't testify, the case weakens. And if the case weakens, the people above Barrett walk. And if they walk, this happens again. Different town, different kids, same system." The maturity in the boy's voice was not the kind that came from wisdom. It was the kind that came from damage, the forced, premature understanding of how the world actually operated, learned not in classrooms but in the back of a transport van, counting hours in the dark. "I'll be there," Ryder said. Eli looked at him. "You don't have to." I'll be there. The beeping filled the silence between them. Lucy had moved slightly. Not much, but enough that she was no longer fully behind Eli. She stood beside him now, her shoulder touching his arm, her eyes on Ryder's face, with an expression that had shifted from evaluation to something tentative and fragile and new. Not trust. Not yet. But the space where trust might eventually grow if no one destroyed it first. Ryder was released from the hospital 6 days later. Mara drove him back to Coldwater in Vic's Silverado because the Sportster was at the bottom of the Coldwater River, and Ryder's truck was still parked at the garage. His left arm was in a sling, 23 stitches total across various parts of his body, 2 cracked ribs of his own now, mirroring Eli's. A prescription for painkillers he'd never fill because pills in small orange bottles reminded him of everything that had been done to Danny. They drove Route 41 in silence. The road looked different in daylight without a storm. Just a 2-lane highway through flat agricultural land, grain elevators in the distance, telephone poles strung with lines that sagged between them like tired arms. The Route 41 motor lodge passed on the left, a single-story concrete motel with a vacancy sign that hadn't been turned off in years. Room 114 was visible from the road. Its door was open. An FBI evidence team was working inside. Ryder didn't look away. He made himself see it. The door, the room, the parking lot where Danny had spent his last conscious hours. He owed his brother that much, the willingness to look at the place where it happened without flinching. Mara said nothing. She kept her eyes on the road and her hands at 10 and 2 and gave him the silence he needed. They reached the garage at midday. Vale Brothers Custom looked the same from the outside. The corrugated roof, the 3 bays, the faded sign with the name that now belonged to only one person. But as Mara pulled into the lot, Ryder noticed changes. The side gate had been repaired. New chain, new padlock. The security cameras, all of them, including Vic's trail cams, had been repositioned to eliminate the blind spots Vic had identified. The front bay door, which had been chain-operated for 2 years, now rolled up on a new hydraulic mechanism. Diesel's tow truck was parked in the back lot. "He's been here every day," Mara said, "fixing things. He replaced your front door mechanism, patched the roof where it was leaking, rewired the camera system. Hasn't said a word about any of it." Ryder got out of the truck and stood in the parking lot. The air smelled like November. Cold, clean, carrying the faint sweetness of decaying leaves and the sharper edge of approaching winter. No rain. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that followed storms, as if the atmosphere was too exhausted to produce color. He walked to the front bay and pushed the button. The new hydraulic mechanism hummed and the door rolled up smoothly, effortlessly, with none of the grinding protest of the old chain system. Inside, the garage had been cleaned. Not just tidied, cleaned. The concrete floor had been scrubbed. The workbenches had been organized. Tools hung on their proper pegs. The oil stains that had been accumulating for years were still there. You couldn't remove those without removing the concrete itself. But everything else was in order. The motorcycles in various stages of repair had been covered with clean tarps. The parts room had been restocked and reorganized. And Danny's workbench, the one with his handwriting on the pegboard, the torque specs and part numbers, and the crude exhaust design had been left exactly as it was, untouched. Every piece of paper, every pencil mark, every smudge of Danny's fingerprints preserved. Diesel stood beside it, a wrench in his hand, his red beard still untrimmed, his expression still unreadable. He looked at Ryder. Ryder looked at the workbench. "Thank you," Ryder said. Diesel shrugged, set down the wrench, walked to his tow truck, started the engine, drove away. That was his goodbye. For now. Diesel would be back. Ryder knew this the way he knew the sound of a healthy engine, intuitively, through years of experience reading the machines and people that mattered to him. Diesel would be back because Diesel had decided this garage was worth maintaining, and once Diesel decided something was worth maintaining, it stayed maintained. Mara left the next morning. She packed her medic bag and her riding gear and wheeled the Indian Scout out of the garage bay where she'd stored it. The November air was sharp, carrying the first real bite of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she strapped the bag to the rear rack. Where? Ryder asked. Cincinnati. There's a Veterans Crisis Center that needs a volunteer trauma medic. They don't pay, but they provide housing. She pulled on her riding gloves, the left one covering the scars she never showed, and looked at Ryder with an expression that was equal parts fondness and warning. It's the kind of work that keeps me away from card tables. Good. I'll check in. You better. She straddled the bike and hit the starter. The Scout's engine rolled over with the smooth, confident sound of a machine that had been built by people who cared about what they were building. Mara looked at the garage, at the sign, at Ryder standing in the bay door with his arm in a sling and his face still stitched and his body still broken in ways that would take months to heal. Danny would be proud of you, she said. You know that, right? Ryder's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak. Take care of those kids, Mara said. They're the best thing that's ever happened to this garage. She pulled out of the lot, turned north on Route 41, and rode out of Coldwater with the engine's sound fading gradually into the distance until it was absorbed by the wind and the silence and the vast, flat emptiness of the Midwestern horizon. Ryder stood in the parking lot for a long time after she left. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That was the strange part. After everything, after the depot and the bridge and the hospital and Barrett's arrest, the days that came next were quiet in a way that felt almost suspicious. Ryder kept waiting for the next crisis, the next threat, the next 2:13 a.m. visit on the securities cameras. But it didn't come. What came instead was paperwork, social workers, court-appointed attorneys, family services assessments, background checks, home inspections, the bureaucratic machinery of a state attempting to determine what should happen to two children who'd been failed by every institution designed to protect them. Eli and Lucy had been placed in emergency foster care in the county next to Mercer, a temporary arrangement that lasted exactly 11 days before Eli called Ryder from the foster home's landline at midnight. She's not sleeping, Eli said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a boy trying to solve a problem he'd been solving alone for too long. She wakes up every 2 hours. She checks the windows, she checks the doors. She won't eat if there's a man in the room. The foster father is a good guy. I know that. But she can't be in a house with a man she doesn't know. Not yet. What do you need? Ryder asked. I need her to feel safe. What does safe look like? A pause. Long enough that Ryder could hear the boy breathing, hear the weight of the question pressing against him. It looks like your garage, Eli said. The process took 3 months. 3 months of hearings, evaluations, character references, and a judge who'd been personally affected by the Barrett revelations, and was inclined to believe that unconventional arrangements sometimes serve children better than institutional ones. Vic testified to Ryder's character. Mara submitted a written statement from Cincinnati. Diesel appeared at the hearing in a clean shirt, the first clean shirt anyone had ever seen him wear. And when the judge asked him to describe Ryder Vale's fitness as a guardian, Diesel said 4 words. He doesn't give up. The judge granted temporary guardianship in January. The garage changed, not all at once, not in some dramatic renovation montage. It changed the way all real things change, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and awkward adjustments and moments of failure that nobody filmed or narrated. The cot in the back office became Eli's bed. He refused anything better. Ryder offered to set up the upstairs apartment, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom that actually worked. But Eli said he wanted to stay in the garage, close to the ground, close to the exits, close to the sound of Ryder working on engines late at night, because the sound of tools on metal had become the thing his nervous system associated with safety. Lucy took the smaller room upstairs. Mara had sent a box of secondhand art supplies from Cincinnati, pencils, markers, a set of watercolors that had been partially used and donated to the Veterans Center, and Lucy had arranged them on the windowsill with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life, as if the proper placement of objects could prevent the world from shifting beneath her feet. She didn't speak much, not at first. Weeks passed where her only communication was through Eli, whispered requests, pointed fingers, the occasional nod or head shake that carried the weight of entire conversations compressed into a single gesture. But she drew. Every day, on whatever surface was available, notebook paper, napkins, the backs of parts invoices, the cardboard flaps of shipping boxes. She drew the garage. She drew the motorcycles. She drew Diesel's tow truck and Mara's Indian Scout from memory. She drew Ryder at his workbench, hunched over an engine, his bandaged arm in its sling, his face in profile. She drew Eli sleeping on the cot. The drawings were not sophisticated. They were 12-year-old drawings, proportions slightly off, perspective approximate, colors chosen by instinct rather than theory. But they were precise in the ways that mattered. The details she included told Ryder exactly what she saw and what she valued: the specific angle of the garage's bay doors, the pattern of oil stains on the concrete floor, the way light came through the high windows at 4 in the afternoon and made golden rectangles on the wall. She was mapping her environment, drawing the place into existence so it couldn't be taken away. Ryder understood this without being told. He'd done the same thing with engines his whole life, disassembling, examining, cataloging every component until the machine had no secrets left, until it was known, until it was safe. He bought her a proper sketchbook from the art supply store in Lima, left it on the kitchen table upstairs without a note. The next morning, it was gone from the table. He found 3 new drawings taped to the garage wall by noon. The first winter was hard. Not externally. The garage had heat, a forced air system that Diesel had serviced in November. And the upstairs apartment was insulated enough for comfort. Ryder had steady work. The Barrett scandal had put cold water on the national news, and with it came attention, visitors, journalists who needed their rental cars serviced, curiosity seekers whose motorcycles conveniently developed problems within town limits. But the nights were hard. Eli's nightmares came in cycles. 3 or 4 quiet nights followed by one that wasn't. Ryder would hear the boy thrashing on the cot at 2 or 3 a.m. and go sit on the concrete floor beside him without touching him, without speaking, just being present until the breathing stabilized and the tremors stopped. Sometimes Eli woke. Sometimes he didn't. On the nights he woke, he'd look at Ryder sitting on the floor in the dark and say nothing, and Ryder would say nothing back, and the silence between them was the most honest conversation either of them had ever had. Lucy's fear of men she didn't know persisted for months. She would leave a room when a customer entered the garage. She wouldn't make eye contact with the mailman. She sat with her back to the wall at the diner where Ryder took them for breakfast on Sunday mornings, her eyes tracking every adult male in the room with the systematic vigilance of someone performing a threat assessment she didn't know how to stop performing. But she started talking, slowly, in fragments. A word here, a sentence there, always directed at Eli first, then gradually, tentatively, like testing ice on a pond, at Ryder. The first full sentence she ever spoke directly to Ryder was on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 4 months after the bridge. He was rebuilding a carburetor at Danny's workbench, his left arm finally free of the sling, but still weak, his movements careful and measured. Lucy stood at the edge of the workbench, watching. She'd been watching him work for 20 minutes, a new habit she'd developed, standing at the periphery of his workspace, studying his hands the way she studied everything, with that intense cataloging attention. "What does that part do?" she asked. Ryder looked up. Lucy was pointing at the carburetor's float bowl, her finger hovering an inch from the metal, not touching. She never touched things without permission. "It controls how much fuel gets into the engine," Ryder said. "Too much and the engine floods. Too little and it starves." "Like eating," Lucy said. "Yeah," Ryder said. "Like eating." She considered this for a moment. Then, "Can I watch you put it back together?" "You can help if you want." Her eyes widened slightly, not with fear, with something else. The startled recognition of being included instead of observed. She pulled a stool to the workbench and sat down. Ryder handed her a clean shop rag and a small socket wrench. "Hold this," he said. She held it. And for the next 45 minutes, they rebuilt a carburetor together in near silence, communicating through pointed fingers and nods and the occasional murmured instruction, while Eli watched from the cot with his hands behind his head and something on his face that might have been, in a different boy, in a different life, called peace. Spring came to Coldwater the way spring always came to the Midwest, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with false warmth followed by cold snaps that reminded everyone that the season had not yet committed to staying. Barrett's trial began in March. Federal court. The prosecution's case was built on 23 photographs, the testimony of 7 children, the cooperation of 14 arrested co-conspirators, financial records spanning 3 decades, and the reopened homicide investigation of Daniel Vale. Eli testified for 2 days. Ryder sat in the gallery behind him, close enough that Eli could turn his head and see him in his peripheral vision. They'd agreed on this arrangement beforehand. Eli didn't need hand-holding, didn't need encouragement, didn't need someone to tell him he was brave. He needed someone to be there, present, visible, unmovable. Ryder didn't move for 12 hours. His cracked ribs ached, his left arm throbbed. The gallery benches were designed for discomfort. None of it mattered. When the prosecution asked Eli to identify the man who had overseen his captivity, the boy turned in his seat and pointed at Barrett with a hand that did not shake. "Him," Eli said. Barrett looked back at him from the defendant's table with the same flat, administrative expression he'd worn his entire career. Eli didn't flinch. The verdict came in May. Guilty on all counts, multiple life sentences, no possibility of parole. Barrett was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, and as he passed the gallery, he looked at Ryder one final time. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Danny's death was officially reclassified as a homicide in June. The county coroner's original ruling was vacated. A new death certificate was issued. The word overdose was removed from every official record and replaced with the truth that Ryder had carried in his chest like shrapnel for 7 years. Ryder drove to the cemetery alone on a Wednesday afternoon. Danny's headstone was simple. Name, dates, nothing else. Ryder had refused to put an epitaph on it because every phrase he'd considered felt like a lie when the cause of death was wrong. He stood in the grass with the June sun warm on his shoulders and his healed left arm hanging at his side, and spoke to his brother for the first time since the night in the garage, when he'd whispered, "I'm sorry," to an empty room. He didn't say much. He said the overdose was gone from the record. He said Barrett was in prison. He said there were 2 kids living in the garage now, and one of them was learning to rebuild carburetors. He said he was sorry it took so long. Then he drove back to Coldwater. The garage was open when he arrived. Late afternoon light angled through the bay windows, making golden rectangles on the concrete floor. The same golden rectangles Lucy drew in her sketchbook, the ones she'd identified as the most beautiful thing about the building. Eli was in the back office, school books spread across the desk beside the security monitors. A tutor came 3 times a week, court-mandated education services, and Eli attacked the material with the same systematic intensity he'd applied to counting hours inside a transport van. He was 2 grade levels behind. He intended to close the gap by September. Lucy was at Danny's workbench, not drawing today. Today she was painting, watercolors on a large sheet of craft paper she'd taped directly to the wall beside the pegboard with Danny's handwriting. Ryder stopped in the bay doorway. The painting was large, larger than anything she'd attempted before. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a building with a triangular roof and 3 rectangular doors. The figures were rendered in Lucy's characteristic style, slightly off proportion, vivid in color, precise in the details that mattered. The tallest figure wore a black jacket and had dark lines on his face that might have been scars. The medium figure stood beside him with one eye slightly different from the other, a faint purple wash of watercolor marking the ghost of a bruise that had healed months ago. The smallest figure stood between them, her hand reaching up to hold the tall figure's hand on one side and the medium figure's hand on the other. Above them, in messy handwriting that was half printed letters and half something more personal, a single word. Home. Ryder stood in the doorway and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Eli appeared beside him. The boy had grown in the past months. An inch, maybe 2. His frame still lean but no longer skeletal. His face still carrying the map of everything that had been done to him, but also carrying something new underneath it. Something that looked, in certain light, like the early architecture of a life that might actually hold together. "She did that this morning," Eli said. "I see it. She used your good watercolors, the ones Mara sent. That's what they're for." They stood side by side in the doorway. A 47-year-old mechanic with scars on his face and a healed arm that ached when it rained, and a 15-year-old boy with one eye that still didn't open all the way and a posture that would always carry the memory of restraints even after the marks had faded. Lucy looked up from the workbench. She saw them watching. Her expression flickered, the brief reflexive calculation of someone assessing whether attention meant danger. And then it settled into something quieter. She went back to painting. That evening, Ryder made coffee in the back office and sat at the desk with the security monitors glowing their familiar green. The cameras showed the parking lot, the side gate, the alley, the back lot, all clear, all quiet. Route 41 was visible in the distance, its traffic lights cycling through their colors for an audience of empty streets. Eli was asleep on the cot, not curled into a defensive ball the way he'd slept that first night. Flat on his back, one arm hanging off the edge, his breathing deep and even. The nightmares still came, but less often. And when they came, there was someone sitting on the floor beside him in the dark, saying nothing, staying anyway. Lucy was upstairs. The light in her window was off. The art supplies on the windowsill were arranged in their careful order. The sketchbook Ryder had bought her, the second one now, the first having been filled cover to cover, lay open on the nightstand. Ryder drank his coffee. He looked at the security monitors. He looked at the boy sleeping on the cot. He looked at Danny's workbench, where Lucy's painting was still taped to the wall beside the pegboard. The word home written above three figures who'd found each other in the last place any of them expected. He thought about the night the storm came in, the night he'd been closing the gate and heard a voice so thin it barely registered above the rain. The night a bruised boy stood in his parking lot with zip-tie marks on his wrists and asked the only question that mattered. "Can I sleep in your garage?" Ryder set the coffee mug on the desk. He pulled off his jacket, the same canvas work jacket he'd worn that night, patched now in three places, the left sleeve replaced after the road rash destroyed the original, and walked into the garage. Eli was asleep. The blanket had slipped off his shoulders. Ryder laid the jacket over him. The boy shifted, didn't wake. His hand found the jacket's collar and pulled it closer, the way a child pulls a blanket in sleep. Instinctive, wordless, the body's oldest language for recognizing safety. Ryder stepped back. He stood in the garage in the quiet, in the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ticking of cooling engines and the distant sound of a truck passing on Route 41. In the smell of motor oil and coffee and clean cotton and the faintest trace of watercolor paint drifting down from upstairs. A man who had spent 7 years believing he destroyed everyone close to him. A man who had carried his brother's death like an engine block chained to his chest, dragging it through every day, every night, every silent hour in a garage that still bore a name he couldn't bring himself to change. He looked at the sign above the bay door. Vale Brothers Custom, plural. He'd never changed it because changing it meant admitting Danny was gone. But standing here now, with a boy sleeping under his jacket and a girl's painting on the wall, and the truth of his brother's death finally written in the language of justice instead of lies, Ryder understood something he hadn't understood before. The sign wasn't wrong. It had never been wrong. Danny was in the workbench he'd built with his own hands, in the pegboard notes that nobody else could read, in the exhaust design sketch that had never been fabricated but still hung on the wall like a blueprint for something beautiful that hadn't been built yet. Danny was in the garage because the garage was what Danny had left behind, and the people sleeping inside it were what the garage had become. Not a graveyard, not a monument, a home. Ryder Vale turned off the lights. He sat down in the desk chair in the back office, the security monitors casting their green glow across his face, the coffee growing cold beside him, the boy's breathing steady in the dark. And for the first time in 7 years, the man who'd spent his whole life believing he couldn't protect anyone fell asleep without dreaming of everything he'd lost. Because the night that bruised boy asked to sleep in his garage was the night both of them were saved.